I'd like to just thank you all for coming out on a dreary Saturday. I think we're going to have a very worthwhile presentation for you here today, and worth coming out. Bill, could I do the next slide, please? Refreshments, we had ringers. If you wouldn't mind turning off cell phone ringers, avoid the distraction. Restrooms are out this door and to the left. Exits, we've got an exit on this side, exit back here, and an exit here should we need to get out. A little bit about me and my background. I've been a pilot since 1964. Hard to imagine, it's been 50 years. I'm amazed that it lasted this long, I guess. As one of my friends said, if I thought I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of myself. Anyway, started in general aviation. I was a private pilot, a flight instructor, a charter pilot, and a corporate pilot, and did that for many years, and then was fortunate enough to get hired with Continental Airlines in 1977. Finished a 35-year career with them last year. I retired in May of 2013. Last 2 years was with United in a merger. I flew the 777 the last 8 years, mostly China. I've been an airplane owner since 2003. I had a Cessna 172 for years, which I love that plane, and now have a old VTail Bonanza. Had that now for 7 years. My contact info is on the bottom of all the handouts, and I hope you all got handouts. You should have 3, possibly 4 handouts. One is 13 pages of the slides that we're going to look at. Then there's another one that's references. If you didn't get those, why come on up and get them? There's big piles of them here in the corner. And there's another one here that we're going to refer to that is this airspace at a glance. This is a pretty good summary of everything we're going to talk about today. So if you did not get any of these, please come on up and get them. As far as questions, as far as handouts, I have a friend who does presentations for a living and has told me several times it's a mistake to give the handouts before the meeting, because people will go heads down looking at the handouts and not be looking at the screen. So please don't do that. I've got a pointer. I'm going to be talking about the screen and pointing out a lot of things on the screen that you're going to want to know. And just know that everything that's on the screen is in the handout, so please don't go heads down on me. All right? Questions? I'd like this to be informal and interactive, but I would respectfully ask that if you have a question, that please ask it if it's only on material we've already covered. Otherwise, we'll probably get to it. Okay? We'll have time at the end for questions, so if you think of questions that you want to ask, please just write them down so we can cover them at the end, okay? All right, so we're going to be talking about a lot of different kinds of airspace. And these areas of airspace are relatively small. Most of the time, if we're going cross-country, we can go direct and not be too concerned, not be too impacted by airspace. It's amazing in our country we still have the freedom to basically go where we want and when we want and how we want. And I really am glad we've retained that freedom. Most of our flights, again, aren't impacted by the various types of airspace that we're going to talk about. The airspaces we are going to talk about are kind of the exceptions to being able to just go direct whenever you want. And it may seem as we get into these different types of airspace that it may seem like it's unnecessarily complex. But I would offer to you that we have restrictions where it's necessary for safety. Our safety or their safety, safety of other people. And really, the restrictions are relatively few, and they're placed where they should be. And when there's not a need for restrictions, we can go where we want. And so that's going to be the bulk of it. So I know it's easy and even fun to complain about restrictions in the FAA and airspace and various things, but the more I've studied it, the more reasonable they seem. It's our job, of course, to know where the restrictions are and to be able to deal with those so we stay out of trouble. All right, so here's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the classes of airspace, the alphabet classes, A, B, C, D, E, and G. There's not an F class of airspace in the U.S. There is internationally, but not in the U.S. We'll talk about special use airspace. There's 5 kinds there. Prohibited areas, restricted warning, military operations areas, and then alert areas. We'll talk about some of the other airspace issues, TFRs and terminal radar service areas, and then we'll talk a little bit about the special flight rules area. We have one here in New York, and then, of course, a big one in Washington. So here's why it's important, I think, to be familiar with this information. One is safety. We have enough separation. We want enough separation between us and other airplanes and hazardous activities to be able to stay out of trouble. Legally, we want to stay out of Bill's office. Nobody likes to do a rug dance. Nobody likes to do a rug dance in front of the FAA. And the more we know, the easier it is to stay out of trouble. Confidence, that's a big thing about learning this airspace. We can boldly go where we can go and where we should be able to go and know where we can't go. All right? And the last thing is fun. It's more fun when we're out there flying and we feel like we know what we're doing. So this is important for student pilots. Do we have any student pilots in here? New pilots? Anybody licensed in the last couple of years? Experienced pilots, and especially pilots who fly IFR most of the time. We got airline pilots in here, we got military pilots, we got corporate pilots who basically fly IFR and don't deal with these classes of airspace. You know, they get an instrument clearance and that clears them to go where they can go, and they're basically being led around by the magenta line. Not to denigrate that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Any Seinfeld fans in here? I'm a big Seinfeld fan. Okay? So, but IFR, here's a couple reasons that IFR guys need to know this. If they're considering canceling an IFR flight in the air, they need to know what airspace they're in and what's the weather required, and can they even cancel. If they're going to depart VFR and pick up a clearance en route, they're going to need to know what is the weather required for when they leave, and how can they climb up to altitude where they could maybe get a clearance in the air and stay VFR. So it's important for all of us. Okay? So here's the handouts again. You've got a copy of the slides, hopefully. You've got this colored diagram of the airspace at a glance. You've got a sheet here on resources. Have you got one of those I can just look at? It's a single sheet. Yeah. Excuse me if this screeches. I want to just let you know what's on the resource. If you don't have one of these that says resources up at the top, hold your hand up and we'll have somebody come around and give it to you. But there's all kinds of references here. And so if you wonder where these topics are covered, either in the FAR or the AIM or the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, it's right here. Okay, so you don't have to spend unnecessary time looking. Also, most of these are available for download if you want. There's a link at the bottom here. It's a box.com website. If you type in the link, you can download any and all of these documents. There's FAA documents, there's AOPA documents. There's some FAA websites for training on TFRs and looking up special use airspace, and even one for NOTAMs. There's also a section here of things we're not going to cover in this presentation. When I was putting this together, this quickly seemed like it would get out of hand if we tried to cover everything. So we're going to spend time covering the stuff that's most useful for us, most likely to run into. But we're not going to cover things like weather minimums above 10,000, weather minimums at night, special VFR, some of the lesser special use airspace, and even other airspace. So you'll see a list here of what we're going to cover. Most of the resources here are free. And down at the bottom, you'll see a list for 2 resources that you have to pay for. One is at King School. John and Martha King do a pretty good airspace review. And then Sporty's has one that's online also. So you can see those there. All right. And my contact info is down at the bottom there also. All right, next slide, please. Here's your best tools for pre-flight planning and flying when you're actually airborne. Current sectional or TAC chart, the airport facilities directory. Remember these little green books that you can buy? There's an amazing amount of information in that AFD, and they're available electronically. If you have an iPad, you have ForeFlight, you can download the AFD and have it right with you. But I recommend you buy one of these things. I know, shell out a few bucks. It's hard for pilots to do. But just thumb through that and be reminded of all the information that's in there. There's airport diagrams, there's information on the airports, and you're not going to get some of that stuff when you call flight service for a weather briefing. So get one of those and take a look through it. There's airport diagrams in the AFD. and they're also available as a download from AOPA. So if you go into an airport that's big enough to have an airport diagram, it's a good idea to download that thing and take a good look. There's hotspots on there, areas where there have been traditional goof-ups in the past, pilots inadvertently taxiing onto a runway or being on the wrong taxiway or taking off on the wrong runway. 1-800 weather brief, of course, we're all calling the flight service for weather briefings. DUOT and DUOTs, if you have an iPad, you have maybe a subscription to DUOT or DUOTs that you can dig up the information on the iPad. And of course, there's some great iPad apps out there. I use 4Flight, and we've got some slides about where to find some of this information in 4Flight. I know Garmin Pilot has a real following, people who like that program, and then WingX is probably the other one. Okay? So as we go through the presentation, be listening for details such as whether distance is statute miles or nautical miles. And also, we're going to have a lot of altitude references. Some of them are going to be up to and including a certain altitude, like a floor of a, or I mean the ceiling of a Class B or Class C. There's a few that are up to but not including. Some of the references are above ground level. Some of the references are above airport elevation. Some are referring to mean sea level, in other words, what you'd see on the altimeter. And the high altitude above 18,000 are flight levels. So we'll be referring to all those. Again, here's our classes of airspace. These classes are an international standard as defined by the ICAO, or the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's part of the UN. It's a international organization to basically make sure that countries around the world are doing many of the same things, or doing these things the same way. So if you fly international, you don't see big changes from what we're used to here. We're looking here at the classes of airspace in the US. G is the least restrictive, and as you move toward the front of the alphabet, there's more and more restrictions. Okay? There's really only two kinds of airspace, and that's controlled and uncontrolled. And controlled airspace is Class E, D, C, B, and A. Those are all controlled. And then the uncontrolled airspace is G. And I put some memory aids here to help us remember what those different classes of airspace are. G is from the ground up. And as we'll see, most of the US is Class G at the surface. And then as you move up in airspace, it can go to any of the other categories. So G, I like G for ground up. E is everywhere else that's not ground or any of these others. D, I like dialogue. Means talk to the tower, or drum-shaped, looks like kind of a drum or maybe a hockey puck. The letter C you could think of for congested or wedding cake. Either one of those works for Class C airspace, and we've got a Class C here in Allentown, and we've got the Allentown expert right here. Class B, you can think of the letter B for big airspace or big airports or even Boeing, if that helps you. Remember that? And then A is A for altitude, which means high altitude, are all for all airplanes under control of air traffic control. All right, so maybe that'll be a help to keep track of all these. Also, a while back, I see a lot of gray hairs in here. You remember some of the old terms for airspace. Used to have a positive control area. It's now called Class A. That's high altitude. Terminal control areas are now called Class B. What used to be airport radar service areas are now Class C. Anybody remember all these terms? Anybody still think in terms of these? Okay, I did too. So, airport traffic area is now considered Class D. What used to be a control zone is now Class E that goes to the surface. We'll talk about that. Controlled airspace, general controlled airspace is now Class E. And then what we used to call uncontrolled airspace is now Class G. Okay, this changed in 1993, by the way. So if you're still thinking these terms, why it's been these new terms have been around for a while. Okay, 1993. So if you've been flying since before then, who knows? Maybe you learned these thoroughly back then and haven't quite adapted to the new ones. Just a reminder here of basic weather minimums, basic VFR weather minimums below 10,000 feet. Most of the airspace we're going to talk about today has these minimums, but there's a few exceptions. But I just wanted to bring up a slide here that had the basic VFR weather minimums. 3 miles visibility, 3 statute miles, 500 feet below the base of the clouds, 1,000 feet above the tops of the clouds, and 2,000 feet horizontal distance from the clouds. Okay. It's different if we're greater than 10,000, increases it just a little bit. Okay, here's our airspace at a glance diagram. I just point out a few things here. This is an AOPA publication. Your sheet has the front and back. These used to be kind of plastic cards that AOPA gave away. They're real handy to tuck into a flight bag. They've stopped giving stuff away. I called them and asked for some of these. They said, "Oh no, you're just going to have to print it off the website." Okay. Anyway, here's our classes. Class G is close to the ground, and that'll be most of the airspace that we're going to talk about or deal with when we're flying is Class G airspace, uncontrolled airspace close to the ground. And the tops of the Class B coincides with the bottom of Class E in most areas. So we'll talk about these various floors. Floors of Class E are the top of Class G. And the Class E airspace is general controlled airspace. We'll talk about where that begins close to the ground and where it ends up high. Class D is around airports with an operating control tower that aren't a Class C or Class B, and they're indicated on the chart with a dashed blue line. The Class C airports are a solid magenta line, and the Class B airports are a solid blue line, okay? There's this dashed red line there is Class E airspace that goes all the way to the surface. Plenty of areas where that is, okay? Okay, so again, here's Class G. We'll start with the least restrictive airspace and work up. Class G, the word uncontrolled refers to IFR flights. You're generally not going to have IFR flights in Class G airspace, especially in the eastern part of the country. In the western part of the country, you can fly IFR in uncontrolled airspace, but we would not expect to see it out in the west, and certainly there's hardly any uncontrolled airspace high enough in the east part of the country to fly IFR, okay? The weather requirements, this is a exception from the general basic VFR. If you're 1,200 feet AGL or less, 1 statute mile visibility and clear clouds. That's not very much. If anybody's experimented trying to fly VFR in that kind of weather, you know it's not good. There's times where it might be safe if you're departing an area that has localized fog or low clouds, but not in general. Don't be out there. If you're more than 1,200 feet, you need the same cloud clearance requirements as basic VFR, but the visibility is down to 1 mile. The reason is there's just not likely to be IFR airplanes out there that are in the clouds that would pop out of the clouds and need some space to see us as VFR pilots, or for us as VFR pilots to see an IFR airplane coming out of the clouds and being able to avoid it. Okay. All airspace in the U.S. is Class G unless it's designated to be some other class. Okay, that's your basic classification. There's no communications requirement to fly in Class G. Don't need a radio. No special pilot requirements and no special equipment needed in the airplane. Okay? So we'll move on to Class E airspace. That's general controlled airspace. And Class E, the memory aid there is everywhere else. And that controlled airspace is most likely just above Class G airspace. It's the most common class of airspace. It's the most amount of cubic feet of airspace other than Class A, which is high altitude flight levels. We'll spend most of our flight time in Class E airspace. There's no communication requirement to fly in Class E airspace, and it's basic VFR. Okay? So here's the choice. Now, Class E. There's 6 choices here for where the lower limit of this Class E can begin. Okay, some of it begins at the surface. We have a slide that'll talk about that. Some of it begins at 700 AGL, which is where we are right now. We're in one of those areas. It starts at 700. We got a slide that describes that. Some of it starts at 1,200 feet above the ground. And some of it is specified as some other above ground level altitude. Some of it, the floor of Class E, is at another specified MSL altitude. And if it doesn't specify for anywhere else, it starts at 14,500. Okay? Bill, can we back up a couple of slides? So just to show you on the chart here where this Class E can begin. There's Class E that begins at the surface. You've got that dashed magenta line. There's Class E that begins at 700. And I'll show you how to figure that out. There's Class E that begins at 1,200. Here's Class E over here that begins at either another MSL altitude or AGL altitude. And if it's not specified anywhere else, that Class E begins at 14,500. And all of these Class E airspace go up to 18,000 MSL. So I like, there's half dozen of these sort of airspace summaries, and I like this one the best because it gives you the best idea where these airspace actually begins. It's nice that it's in color also. I'm a visual guy. I like to see things in color. All right? Yes, John? Well, we got some slides of that. There's Class D extensions. There's also Class E surface extensions. There's two kinds. One is blue and the other is magenta. We got slides on that. Thank you. All right. So the ceiling goes up to 18. And so the next slide. If you look at now, this is a wide view of where we are. There's Newark. Here's Allentown. I just wanted you to get a general look at this airspace. And you'll see these patterns where you have the magenta boundaries. Can you see them? All of those magenta boundaries tell you inside that magenta boundary or the soft side of the display there. Remember, there's a hard side and then a soft side. Inside the soft side of that magenta, the floor of Class E airspace is 700 feet. You can see here's a big area right there. That whole area is Class E airspace that starts at 700. There's one, a kind of an irregular shape around an airport right there. Here's one here that's a very irregular shape that goes around many airports. Inside that whole boundary, the Class E airspace starts at 700. Outside the boundary, or by the sharp edge of the vignette there, is Class E airspace starts at 1200. Now, you may wonder, well, how does this affect us? Well, it affects us because of weather. Below Class E airspace, you need clear clouds in a mile. In Class E airspace, you need 3 miles visibility, and you need 500 below the clouds, 1,000 feet above, 2,000 horizontal. So these floor of Class E is a weather distinction. No difference in communication, no difference in pilot requirements, no difference in what the airplane needs, but it's a difference in what the weather has to be to fly legally, fly legal VFR, okay? All right, so let's go to the next slide. We'll zoom in here. Here's the airport, the Finger Lakes Airport, and you can see it's an uncontrolled airport with the, or as we like to call it here, a pilot-controlled airport. Uncontrolled sort of has an out-of-control connotation, which we don't want, but so this is a pilot-controlled airport. There'd be a CTAF here. But you can see this magenta vignette. Inside that area, the controlled airspace starts at 700 feet above the ground. And as a minor point here, it's not 700 feet above the airport elevation. It's 700 feet above the actual terrain that exists within that, that magenta circle. So below that, it's Class G, clear clouds in a mile, and above that, it's Class E, which is so many feet, 500 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above, 2,000 horizontal. So, okay. Now, outside this magenta vignette, can you see that's the sharp side? Outside, the floor is 1,200 feet above ground level. So below 1,200 feet AGL here, you're in Class G airspace. 1,200 or above, you're in Class E airspace, and you need the basic VFR weather minimums. I tried to pick as much as possible local examples here, the kind of airports and airspace that we're going to find right in our area. So this Class E airspace, whether you're in the area that starts at 700 feet above the ground or 1,200 feet, goes up to 18,000 feet. Okay? Okay. Here, this zooms in a little bit to look at our local area. We have Sky Manor is here. Allentown, of course, is here. But just to take a look at the zoom in on the local area we've got right here. You can see the Sky Manor here is within this magenta vignette shape right here, which means here we have Class E airspace that starts at 700 feet above the ground. We're at 560 here, airport elevation, and so add 700 to that, we're at 1,260 feet, okay? So our pattern altitude is 1,560 feet. So if you're 1,260 feet or less here, you're in Class G airspace. Clear of clouds in a mile is what you need. But at our pattern altitude here, the pattern altitude is high enough here that we are on Class E airspace, which means we need basic VFR weather minimums to fly in the pattern here. Okay? And you can see that some of these other shapes, there's the magenta, another boundary there. Everything that's in that boundary is Class E starting at 700. Everything that, the little areas here, can you see that little area right there? That is on the sharp side of the magenta. There's where Class E starts at 1,200 feet above the ground. Of course, we have here Allentown's Class C airspace, which we'll talk about. Any questions on Class E so far and weather, what the weather requirements, why it matters to us about Class E?
Do you have what the rationale is? Like, why did they choose 500, 1,000, and 2,000? Might help me remember some numbers better. If I need, like, why is it okay to be just 500 below, but you really need
Okay.
2,000?
The question here, it's a good question, is what's the rationale with the cloud clearance requirements for basic VFR? We have to be 500 feet below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 horizontally. And the issue there is to allow enough space around the clouds so an airplane popping out of the clouds has a chance to see us, or we have a chance to see airplanes popping out of the clouds and being able to avoid them. Most high-performance airplanes will climb faster than they descend. So that's why you have 1,000 feet above and only 500 feet below. Okay, the reason you want 2,000 feet horizontal is if the airplane goes fastest laterally. So an airplane coming out of the clouds can be anywhere from 100 knots to 250 knots. So it gives you a little more space. The reason it's greater above 10,000 is for the same reason. Above 10,000, you need 1,000 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above, and then a mile horizontally. Well, that mile, there's no speed limit above 10,000, so you can have airplanes going 300 knots, and you know, they're going to cover that mile in a short time. So, but that's the general reason. Thanks for that question. One of the issues you have here with this Class E airspace being as low as it is here is that if you take off from Sky Manor and you're going to stay in the pattern, you're in Class E airspace in the pattern, and you have to be 500 feet below the clouds. Any clouds that are out there, you have to be 500 feet below. So the real weather minimum is not a ceiling of 1,000 feet. That's not quite enough. You need about 1,500 feet. Your pattern's going to be 1,000 feet above the ground, but any clouds out there, you still have to be 500 feet below. True at any airport with a tower also. You see the weather, the minimum weather reported as 1,000-foot ceiling, and that's true. You have to have at least 1,000-foot ceiling reported to take off from an airport with a tower. But 1,000 feet is not generally high enough for really what we need. We need that whole 1,500. Okay? All right. So we're going to move on and talk about the floor of Class E airspace other than 700 feet above the ground or other than 1,200 feet above the ground. And you see, can you see that right there? Now this is the western part of the country, which you have to go to the west to see some of these examples. But you can see right there, there's the Class E airspace that starts at 1,700 above ground. A little bit unusual. Okay. These they look like tire tracks, will tell you where there's a change in the floor of Class E airspace. So in this area right here, can you see this whole area? That area, Class E airspace, starts at 1,700 feet above the ground. On the other side of this little symbol, it's back to 1,200 feet above the ground. Okay, if it's not specified, it's 1,200 feet above the ground. And here you see the magenta vignette where inside that, the Class E airspace starts at 700 feet above the ground. So again, it's an issue of how good does the weather have to be for us to fly legally and safely. It took me a while to find that too. I don't mind admitting that. I searched basically the whole country to try and find that. All right, let's go to the next one. Here's Class E airspace that starts at another MSL altitude. Can you see this one right there? This area right here, the Class E airspace starts at 9,000 feet MSL. So below that, it's Class G airspace, which is uncontrolled. Okay? 9,000 feet and above, it's Class E airspace. Here's an area right here where Class E airspace starts at 7,500 MSL, and you can see that symbol there that tells you where there's a change in the floor of that Class E airspace. Okay? This chart also, if you can see the blue, it's color doesn't really show up that well here, but that's blue. And on the inside, or the soft side of that blue, if it weren't designated otherwise, you'd have the Class E airspace starting at 1,200. It's kind of unusual to see this blue vignette. You got a magenta area here where the Class E airspace starts at 700. Again, that's a weather requirement. But you look here where the terrain is, there's a lot of airspace below that where that's uncontrolled. Clear clouds in a mile, that's what you need. Okay? So there's some Class E airspace. If it's not designated at any other level, then Class E airspace starts at 14,500. And if you look at this area right here with the blue vignette, on the soft side of that vignette, the controlled airspace starts here as it's marked. Okay? Or over here, it's, what does that say? 8,500 MSL. But inside, in the sharp area here, there's no other designation for Class E airspace, and that Class E airspace starts at 14,500 and goes up to 18,000. Okay? So there's parts of the country, mostly in the west parts of the country, where Class E, the floor of Class E is not designated to any other value, and it defaults up here to 14,500. Okay? So again, just to reiterate, whether you're in Class G or whether you're in Class E is a weather issue. Okay? Need basic VFR minimums if you're in Class E airspace. You know, Bill is good about letting his reps pick the topic that they want. And I will tell you that when I get interested in a topic, it's mostly because I need the refresher in that area. And I'm willing to spend the time to learn it and, you know, hopefully pass it on to you. But this is an area where I thought I knew it pretty well. I guess I knew it well enough to stay out of trouble. But there's plenty of fine points here that we'll point out here that will hopefully help you as well. Okay? All right, so next slide talks about communication. And there are areas where we need to talk to air traffic control. And two of them that we're going to talk about next are Class D airspace and Class C airspace. What's required before we enter these areas? And we got plenty of slides with detail on the Class C and Class D. But what we need before entering Class D airspace and Class C airspace is to establish communication. Okay, that's a very specific term, establish communications. And what that means is that when air traffic control, whether it be a tower or approach control, responds with your call sign, you have communications has been established. You've called them, they've called back and given your call, stated your call sign. When they do that, and they don't specifically say to remain clear of the airspace, then communication is established and you can enter the airspace. So if you're approaching an airport with a tower, and let's say you're 10 miles out and you call them, and they will tell you something like stand by or go ahead, you have established communication. You can proceed in and enter that Class D airspace. Or if you leave Sky Manor and you're going westbound and you call Allentown, as soon as they call back with your call sign, they may say stand by, hold on, may say go ahead. As soon as they respond with your call sign and haven't told you to remain clear, you have established communication and you can continue into their airspace. There's no clearance to enter the airspace. A tower never says cleared to enter Class D. Approach control will never say you're cleared to enter Class C. It's just understood that once you establish communication, you can enter their airspace, okay, or fly through it, whatever you're doing. Sometimes you'll get a call back. Cessna 4 November Alpha, remain clear of Class D or remain clear of Class C. Okay, well, that's a different thing. You're going to circle, go around the airspace, whatever's appropriate for that, for your situation. Okay? Any question about the established communication? Yes.
Well, let's say you're flying, you want to transition through Morristown airspace, and you call them up. You really don't have to say, may I transition? You you know, if they say yes, they really don't have to say yes. I mean, they can say no, but they don't have to say specifically yes, as long as they say your call sign.
The question is, if you're going through Morristown airspace, will they specifically clear you through their airspace? And the answer is no. Morristown's Class D. So,
But they say, yes, you're clear to transition.
well,
They're not clear, maybe they say, I don't know what they say, yes, you're.
there's no clearance.
Yeah, I know.
They're not going to
That's the
say,
terminology they use.
proceed,
Yeah,
Roger. Some towers have radar, they might have a squawk, so they can make sure they're looking at you. But, yes, Neil.
I've heard various rules of thumb about when to try and establish communication. Some say you've got a slow plane do it 10 miles an hour, some say you've got a fast plane do it 15 miles an hour. Do you have any rules of thumb on when to try and establish communication?
10 miles is fine, or at least 5 miles outside the airspace. Or call them as soon as I think they'll answer. Yeah, there's no harm in calling early. If you're coming into a highly controlled airport, the AIM says you should make a call 10 miles out. Other questions? Yes, sir. Okay. All right. Yes, yes, sir.
Everything that Craig just said is 100% accurate, and whether you're arguing the point of whether you establish communication or not, you've probably already got to the point where you're standing in Bill's office and you're defending yourself against the pilot deviation. I'm going to suggest that if you're basing this on Cessna 400 number Alpha standby, yes, you've established it, but there was a reason you didn't get more communication out of that controller. He was busy doing something of a higher priority at the time. I'm going to just ask, please make a second effort if he didn't get back to you within a 30-second period.
Okay, good point. And let me put a plug in here for VFR flight following or radar advisories. I am a huge fan of this. And most of my flights, when it's available, I'm talking to approach control, I'm talking to the center. They've given me a squawk, and I'm getting flight following from them. That's huge. You're already talking to the people who know the answers to your questions and who can really help you. So if you're not in the habit of calling for VFR advisories, I would urge you to give it a try and just check out all the benefits. One of them is this: if you're flying along and there's a Class C out in front of you, you're already talking to the guy who owns that airspace. And you've established communications and you can go through it, okay, unless he tells you otherwise. You can't ever fly contrary to an ATC instruction. But I'm just a real fan of the flight following, okay? Yeah. Well, it gets the count up, but the other thing from the controller's viewpoint is they know who's out there. And if they need to call that airplane to warn them of other traffic, they know they can do it. The worst thing for a controller's viewpoint is to see a couple of airplanes coming together on the scope and not be able to talk to both of them. Yes, sir?
Question for you. When I hear standby, to me that says stay away.
Not necessarily. It's a communications thing.
It is, because I've always thought you're busy and I'll just wait a minute. I'll just circle for a second and then usually come back. But you're saying standby is
30 seconds. If we don't get back in 30 seconds. Now, again, you're going to base on what you hear. If he's just constant talking, it's like, well, that standby's going to go for a minute or 2 minutes before he gets back to you. And then you just might need a reminder.
so standby's not a no.
Yeah, no is stay out of our airspace. So this is...
The bottom on aircraft calling standby, that's the no.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. This is not responding with your call sign. Okay? If they don't respond with your call sign, then you have not established communication. Thank you for that. But on the other hand, if they have said something like stand by, proceed on. And that's one of the benefits of learning these rules, is you're not circling unnecessarily or you're not going around airspace unnecessarily. If you've established communication, you can enter the airspace.
Now, I don't do violations, okay, safety guys, I don't do that stuff. But if you end up with a airspace violation or non-complying with ATC, the tapes are there. There's no point in trying to make up something or try. He did this, whether it's an air traffic controller error or a pilot error. The tapes are there, and we listen to them. So you know, and just be honest, and it's the best policy.
It is the best policy. We're talking about avoidance here, avoiding pilot deviation, so you're not in front of Bill's Bill's peers over there explaining what you did. But I tell you, if you screw up, fess up. It's the easiest and most straightforward all the way around. Okay, so we'll move on to talk about Class D. Here's a typical Class D area around an airport. And you might think of it as a shape of a drum or dialogue. That's the need to talk to them. Okay, next slide, Bill. Okay, here's back to our airspace at a glance side. Here's our Class D airspace. It starts at the surface, and it goes up to the generally 2,500 feet above the ground, but it's as shown on the chart. Okay, we'll have a couple examples of that where we'll see the actual ceiling and see the boundaries of Class D. But you'll have Class D airspace around an airport with an operating control tower that's not a Class B airport or a Class C airport. They have, Class B airports have control towers, Class C airports have control towers. This is a operating control tower that's not designated a Class C or B. Generally, it's a 5 statute mile radius, but the actual boundary is on the chart. It's that dashed blue line. And generally up to and including 2,500 feet above the airport elevation. That's the general dimensions, but you always want to look on the chart and see what the actual ceiling is. You need basic VFR weather minimums, plus you need a reported ceiling of at least 1,000 feet and 3 statute miles visibility. Remember I said if you've got a ceiling of 1,000 feet, you really don't have enough if you're going to be 500 feet below those clouds, so keep that in mind. There's that magic term, establish communications with a tower before entering Class D. That's if you're arriving. Remember that the tower is never going to say cleared into Class D. You establish communication, they expect you just to proceed in. Or if you're flying through the Class D airspace. You mentioned, Jim, you mentioned flying through Morristown's Class D airspace. If you call them and they respond with your call sign, you have established communication and you can proceed on. Okay? You can be a little bold in that area. If you're taking off from an airport, you have to establish communication, and that's when you call the tower for takeoff and they clear you for takeoff. So you're establishing communication even when you depart the airport as well. Okay? Now, one point here about towers is their job is to provide separation on the runway. Make sure there aren't 2 airplanes on the runway at any given time. They don't have the responsibility to provide separation in the air. May sound like it from what they say. Report left downwind, make straight in, whatever. That's providing an orderly, expeditious flow of traffic. But they are not tasked with providing separation. Very sad example of that in Frederick, Maryland. I think 10 days or so ago. Helicopter and a Cirrus collided. The tower's really not on the hook for that. Okay? Their job is not to provide separation in the Class D airspace, but only provide separation on the ground. Now, if there is another airport within the boundaries of the Class D, a secondary airport, if you're flying into that airport, you do have the obligation to call the tower that's managing that Class D airspace and establish communication with them. All right? If you're taking off from a secondary airport within Class D, and you cannot establish communication with a tower on the radio, you can take off and establish communication as soon as practical. Okay, yes, sir.
I have a question about what you just said before about the tower not providing separation when you're in their airspace.
Right.
Is that wouldn't be true of an IFR flight, though, would it? Because once ATC turns you over to the tower on an IFR flight, you know, to clear and to land, aren't they providing separation?
They will provide separation between other IFR airplanes, but not between you as an IFR flight and another VFR flight. Like IFR flights do not have priority in airspace because they happen to be IFR. So the takeaway here is that you've got to listen very carefully for who else is in the pattern and have that situational awareness of who else is out there. Because they do not provide separation in the air. They only provide separation on the runway. And think about what they tell you when you're cleared for takeoff. It's a clearance. You're cleared for takeoff. They are ensuring separation with that clearance, or cleared to land. They are assuring separation between you and any other airplanes on the runway, but not in the air. Okay? In fact, there's only a few times where you really need a clearance as a VFR pilot. You need a clearance to take off, you need a clearance to land, and you need a clearance to go into Class B airspace. Those are the times you need to hear the magic words, cleared. Okay, other than that, you don't. You don't get a clearance into Class D, you don't get a clearance into Class C. Okay, you don't need one in E, you don't need one in G. So, all right, so let's move on. I like pictures a lot. Here's local airspace in Trenton, New Jersey. And just to point out a few things, can you see the dashed blue line there? That is the boundary of their Class D airspace. Most of it is 5 statute miles from the center of the airport. And you've got a little extension right here. There's your Class D extension. That Class D extension goes right up to the Yardley VOR. And the purpose of that extension is to make sure that arriving and departing IFR airplanes stay in controlled airspace. So as this boundary here is Class D, the requirement to get into Class D is established communication with the tower. So this extension here moves out the area where you have to establish communication before you fly in. Okay, can you see that? The ceiling of their Class D is right here, 2,700 feet. That's MSL. And that is up to and including 2,700 feet. The tower here is available from early in the morning until late at night. And the tower closes at night. And this airspace reverts to Class E airspace. That means you have Class E or controlled airspace now all the way down to the surface. And you know that this airspace reverts to Class E because of looking in the AFD. If you look at every airport, the information for every airport is in certain categories. And down toward the bottom of every airport, there's a category of airspace. And it specifically says that this Class D airspace becomes Class E. Okay? So what's the effect of that? That means even when the tower is closed, this area right here is Class E airspace, and you have to have basic VFR minimums. You can't get away with clear clouds in a mile. You need the 3 miles. And you need the distance from clouds. Okay? So when the tower is open, you have to establish communication before coming into this area. When the tower closes, there's no need to establish communication. Okay? It's a good idea to know when the tower's closed. The tower closes, I think, at 11 p.m. If you're flying in at 11:15 p.m., good to know that there's not going to be a tower there. Okay? Saves a little consternation. I'm for avoiding consternation. Yes, sir?
So we're okay flying over it at whatever, 3,000 and not establishing?
Yes. Now, it's not a bad idea to establish. And if you're anywhere in this area, you could be talking to Philadelphia Approach Control and be getting advisories. Okay, which I highly recommend. If you're not in the habit of doing that, get with an instructor who is familiar with flight following and go out and practice with you. Okay, it's not that difficult. These guys, especially Allentown. Allentown is a great facility. They bend over backwards to help us. All right. Now, one minor point here is if you're getting advisories, and I sometimes come through here going down to Eagles Nest Airport at the shore. If I'm at 2,500 feet out here and I'm talking to Philadelphia Approach, unless they tell me otherwise, I'm perfectly okay to go through this Class D airspace at 2,500 feet because I have established communication. Okay? Now, most approach controllers, what that means from their viewpoint is they're going to get on the phone with the tower and advise the tower that I'm coming. Okay? Now, if the approach control says, call Trenton Tower, well, then you're going to switch frequencies, call Trenton, and then establish communications directly with Trenton Tower, and then when you're past their airspace, you can go back to approach control. When they do that, I always ask them if I can keep the same squawk and call them on the other side of the airport. Every time they said, yes, please do that.
I'm not sure on that one. I'd like to hear it today, or do you know that?
Yes. The Air Traffic Controller's Handbook is 7110.65. It's one of the references. Well, okay, it's not that I'm a wizard on FAA documents, don't get me wrong. But we did a presentation here a while back called Radar Services for VFR Flying, which was a great seminar. If there was enough demand, I'd be happy to do that one again. But I actually, in that presentation, have the reference in 711065 that specifically says that. Okay? Now again, I'm normally getting radar advisories and see this happen. 90% of the time, you stay with approach control and they do the coordination to go through this Class D at less than the ceiling. Every once in a while, it's call the tower. I hate when they say that. Okay? Yeah. All right, so there is a Class D extension. And this extension increases the requirement to communicate with the tower in that Class D airspace.
When you said they told you to call the tower, what did they yell at you for being there?
No, they just handed me off to the tower so I could establish my own communication with the tower to fly through the airspace. No, I was approaching it. Yeah. But point is here, if you're getting advisories, and the approach control doesn't have you call the tower, they are your established communication already. They're taking care of coordination and stuff.
Let me just add to what Craig said. Typically, and the way Craig said it is correct, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, but most times there'll be approach control, be Trenton, Philly, 8 northwest, southeast bound, 3,000 or 2,500 feet, and he'll come back. So, I got a couple others out there. Put them on. In other words, in that particular instance, the tower say, I want to talk to him. It's not the norm necessarily, but in that particular case. So that's where approach goes back and says, contact tower 0.7, and he might add something on the tail end of that. When you're clear, come back to me. You'll stay on the same spot. You might add things like that. But usually, the radar controller is in a better position to watch what's going on. And usually, as Greg said, the tower controller's responsibility is back at the runways. He doesn't want to come and go. He's 3.5 miles out from the airport, unless he has something very specific going on there. Maybe he's got state police helicopters doing some activity out that way that are on the tower's frequency. And I would call it the exception.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. The next slide just shows irregular shapes for some Class D airspace. There is Caldwell right there. There's Caldwell's Class D airspace, and here's Morristown's Class D airspace. And if you notice, they coincide right there. The Morristown airspace is a full circle, and the Caldwell airspace has a little bit of a cutout here in its airspace. Okay? Ceilings are 2,700 for both Class D airspaces. Okay? So they're not always round. That's part of the issue here. And I've had taken off from Caldwell coming back to Sky Manor, which goes right through Morristown's airspace. I've asked the Caldwell Tower to let Morristown know that I'm coming, just so there's no, I don't surprise them. I don't want to get a handoff right here at the border and wonder whether I can establish communication with Morristown. So I've asked Caldwell Tower to give them a heads up. They've always said, hey, we're already talking to them, don't worry. All right? So another thing to notice here, we haven't quite talked about Class B airspace yet, but I'll just point out that both of these airports are in a segment of the Class B airspace where the floor is 3,000. That's down to and including 3,000. This top of the Class D airspace here is up to and including 2,700. So you've got a shade under 300 feet there where you potentially could be above the Class D airspace for either Morristown or Caldwell and below the Class B airspace. Can you legally fly through there? Yes. Okay.
There's a rumor, I don't know if it's a rumor, that the redesign of your Class B airspace and then take that 300 and get it to the Bravo.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Okay. So you can legally go through there. You can go through there without talking to either tower. You can go through there without talking to New York Approach Control. But I will tell you that the approach controller's task, John, you could confirm this, is to provide 500-foot separation between IFR airplanes and VFR airplanes. And I inadvertently caused ATC some distress one day coming southwestbound to Sky Manor. I wanted a descent clearance through the Class B. The controller said, remain clear of Class B. And, by the way, get off my frequency. He didn't quite say it in those words, but he said frequency change approved. Well, I thought I was doing a smart thing here, and I came through here at 2,800 feet. Okay? Legal? Yes. But I'm still listening to approach control, who now has airplanes arriving for Newark here at 3,000. He had to turn those airplanes so that there was 500 feet separation between where I was at 2,800 feet and his airplane. So I'm still listening to this. I'm going, oh man. Oh, actually, I thought he shot himself in the foot. Okay? He kissed me goodbye. I'm now doing something that's perfectly legal, but yet it still caused him an issue. I think he'd have been smarter if he just let me descend through the B or keep me on his, talking to him. But so,
You don't comment in New York, right?
I asked, that wasn't one of the topics.
okay. Also notice here, this is a real minor point, is that part of this Class D airspace is within this portion of Class B airspace. The floor here is 1,800. The ceiling here of the Class D is 2,700. Can you see that? Now, the AIM has a section, it's in section 3, one of the first few paragraphs, that says if you ever have two classes of airspace that conflict, that the higher class of airspace takes precedence. So here you'd have restrictions for Class B airspace here, 1,800 and above. Okay, there is that hierarchy. You'd have to call New York approach here. Yes. You can disregard this portion of the Class D that's in Class B. You have to satisfy the requirements of Class B, which is a clearance. Yes, sir. Yes, that's true. If you're below the floor of Class B, you still have to meet the requirements for the Class D airspace. Okay? All right. The next one here should be White Plains. Here's New York City here. Here's the White Plains Airport. And if you look here at the boundary here of Class D, you can see it has a couple of extensions. There's an extension here for an IFR approach coming from the north. There's another one here for an IFR approach coming from the south. And so these extensions, as I mentioned for Trenton, that's a communications requirement anytime you're going to fly within these dashed blue lines. But what I wanted to point out here is the top of the Class D airspace is 3,000. But you see the little minus sign in front of it? It'd be easy to miss that. The minus sign means it's up to and not including 3,000. So the top of their Class D airspace goes to 2,999 feet. And the reason for that is the Class B airspace here has a floor of 3,000. So there's no airspace here that's just two classes of airspace. 2,999 feet below, you have to satisfy the requirements for Class D with a tower, and 3,000 you have to have a clearance to be in the Class B. So that's just a non-standard ceiling. Okay, there's a whole bunch of these around. There's a bunch of. Well, when you get to Class B, there's non-standard floors of Class B also, where it's down to but not including. I got a slide of that. So, okay, let's do one more view. All right, so here's Binghamton, New York. And there is Class D airspace, that's the blue circle. Can you see that? What's the requirement to get into Class D airspace? Establish communication, and you have to establish communication within the blue boundary. But here's a dashed magenta area right here. There's one here and there's another one here. This is this Class E airspace that goes all the way to the surface. This is to allow IFR airplanes to stay in controlled airspace. And this dashed magenta area brings the weather minimums for controlled airspace to the surface. Okay? There's no communications requirement out here. You could fly right through that area without calling the tower, but you do have to have basic VFR weather minimums to do that. Okay? Can you see the difference? Communications requirement is the Class D, and this Class E to the surface is a weather issue. Now, is it a good idea to call a tower anytime you're close by? Yes, it is a good idea. Is it required in this area? If I get my pointer to work here. Is it required in that area? No, it's not. Okay. Okay, so we'll move on from Class D and talk about Class C. Oh, actually, we're going to talk about, whoops, it's not on my, guess I turned 2 pages at once here. There are some areas where transponders are required, and we'll just talk about that here before we talk about Class C airspace. Transponder with either Mode C or Mode S is required, and that has the altitude reporting capability. You have to have that in Class A airspace, up high in the flight levels. You have to have it in Class B and C airspace, which we're about to talk about. In Class B and Class C, and also above Class C in Class B airspace up to, but not including 10,000. You have to have it with a Mode C veil within 30 miles of a primary airport in Class B. I've got some slides that'll show that, up to and not including 10,000. And then you need a transponder with mode altitude reporting anywhere above, at and above 10,000 MSL. Okay? So that's when a transponder is required. It's not required in other airspace, not required in Class G, not required in Class E, not required in Class D. Good idea, but not required. Anybody fly an airplane without a transponder? Okay. With no electrical system? Okay. There's some exceptions for airplanes without electrical systems, but it has a J3. Same thing. Okay. All right, so next slide. Here's the general shape of Class C airspace. Our memory aid here is C for congested or C for cake. It's a 2-layer. The center area here is generally 5 miles and goes all the way up to generally 4,000 feet above the airport elevation. The outer layer here goes from 1,200 feet above the ground up to 4,000 feet. There's 122 Class C airspaces in the 50 states. We have a couple that are close by here. We have, of course, we have one in New Jersey, which is Atlantic City. There are one in Pennsylvania. The only one in the entire state of Pennsylvania is at Allentown. There are 5 in New York: Albany, Buffalo, Islip, Rochester, and Syracuse, and 1 in Connecticut, Windsor Locks. Okay. So again, there's our Class C airspace. It's the base, the solid magenta line on our sectional charts indicates Class C airspace. The charts will indicate the floors, or the ceilings rather. The floor is always the surface. The ceiling is generally 4,000 feet above the airport, but it's whatever it's. You have to look on the chart, I guess, to make sure of what the actual airspace is. Okay, next one, Bill. So Class C airspace exists at airports with a control tower and with approach control and certain traffic levels. An ATC has radar and they provide radar sequencing. Somebody mentioned traffic count. Who was that? About getting advisories. The traffic count's important. So when you call approach control and you're asking for, say, flight following, there's a check in the box that you ask for their service that helps them to keep their count up. I think it makes a difference in pay too, doesn't it? It does, yes. He's nodding his head, yes. So you don't feel like you're imposing on them, okay? Their count just went up by 1, so that's a good thing. Plus, I think they're generally happy to talk to you rather than just wonder who you are as you fly through their airspace.
Great question. The ATC provides radar sequencing. Now, that's not separation again, correct?
Well, there's certain separation in Class C airspace. Certainly separation between IFR airplanes, and there is not separation, as I understand. John, correct me on this if I'm wrong. I don't think there's legal separation provided between an IFR airplane and VFR airplane. I think there's advice, right? Advisories? Green in between, okay. The targets can't merge on the scope.
But as far as that sequence and the separation, keep in mind that when Class C was built, this is my opinion, so I believe I'm right, it's really based around air carrier operation. And it's really designed to protect that aspect of commercial aviation. So when we say sequencing and separation, it's like if you're flying a Cherokee and you're on a 1-mile final and you're going to be followed by an Airbus 319, we've got to make sure that that Airbus 319, when you cross the threshold, there's still 3 miles to the Airbus 319. So that we're taking into account quite a lot of variations in performance. And that's what we mean by sequencing, and approach control is providing the sequencing. That doesn't count. The tower works their traffic pattern around what approach control gives you. I'm talking just about Class C airspace, not D.
Okay. Can you hear him okay? Okay, good. Okay. So when you establish communication, once a communication is established, that's what you need to enter that airspace. So just remind you again that there's no clearance. You're not going to hear cleared into Class C airspace. Establish communication, and you can proceed into the airspace. So you do need a transponder also. Now, if there's a secondary airport within the core area, in other words, within the Class C airspace, if you're flying into that secondary airport, you do need to establish communication with the approach control in the area, let them know. If you're departing a secondary airport and you cannot establish communication on the ground with approach control, it's okay to take off and establish communication in the air as soon as practical. I couldn't find a local example of a secondary airport in Class C airspace, but if you see one, you encounter one, why just know you can take off. And Queen City, we're going to see it here. Queen City is not in Class C. There's a little cutout for Queen City. We'll see that in just a minute, but thank you for thinking of that. Okay? All right, let's go to the next one. Yeah. The next slide will show that. Here's Allentown's Class C airspace. And just point out that there's the 10-mile circle, and here's the inner circle. The inner circle is generally 5 miles in radius. It's, in this case, starts at the surface and goes up to 4,400 MSL, up to and including 4,400 MSL. The outer area here is divided into 3 segments. This segment right here, can you see that? Has a floor of 2,800 feet and a ceiling of 4,400 feet. The area down here that's kind of west or southwest has a floor of 1,900 feet and a ceiling of 4,400 feet. And this area right here has a ceiling of 2,200 feet, I'm sorry, a floor of 2,200 feet, down to and including 2,200 feet, and up to and including 4,400 feet. So to fly into this area, you have to establish communication. If you've called approach control and they've acknowledged your call sign, you've established communication, you can fly in. If you're departing the main airport here at Allentown, you establish communication when you take off, okay? If you're flying through, you establish communication, you can go right on through. Now here's this little area right here. It's a little hard to see on the chart, but there's a cutout here that excludes Queen City from the Class C. Now, can you take off from this airport and turn in the direction of Allentown without established communication? The answer is no. So if you're taking off from Allentown and you want to, if you're taking off from Queen City and you want to proceed in this direction, you've really got to take off, go southbound. Stay clear of Class C, don't climb up through 2,200. Establish communication. Once communication is established, then you can turn and fly into Class C. You will have established communication first, and then you're okay to enter that airspace. Okay? Bill, that addresses your concern? Yeah. Now, if on the other hand, Allentown Queen City Airport was in the Class C, you could take off and establish communication as soon as practicable. Okay? But it's not in Class C. That's the key point here. You're not in it, so you can't enter it without establishing communication. All right? I'm going to go kind of quickly here. This is the first time I've done this presentation, so I was unclear of how long it's going to take. So in order to keep from going too far, I think we will go over based on where we are. Yeah. Anyway, this slide just shows you the islip Class C, and this is a very irregular boundary. Normally they're 10 miles in diameter, but here's one that for whatever reason is a very, very unusual shape. And you'll see here that most of it starts at 1,500 feet and goes up to 4,100 feet. The core area here goes from the surface to 4,100 feet. And there's a little cutout here for the Bayport Airport, where the Class C goes down 700 feet. So a bunch of biplanes kept here. We kind of intending to go over there and check the place out. They did a calendar a couple of years ago, nude pilots. These are old guys. It was tastefully done, and it's hilarious. Were you on that calendar, bud?
Yeah, no, I know the group. I want to get out there in my Cub without a radio. Can I do it?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
Well, you don't have transponder.
Yeah, but people won't. I don't know. They fly biplanes out of there all the time. They go upstate Jersey and all.
Well, you might be right. I mean, there's an exception for airplanes that were certified without an electrical system.
Oh, that's a Cub. I have a Cub.
Yeah, Piper Cub. I guess you could probably do that. Take a little study to make sure that you'd be okay in every class of airspace that you're.
Yeah.
That phone call, yeah, probably a dozen phone calls. Anyway, there's unusual Class C dimensions there. Okay. All right, let's move on to Class B. Class B, you've got this upside down tier of multi-levels. You can think of Class B as big airport or Boeing or big airspace, anything that uses the B for big. Take a look at the next slide, Bill. Here's back to our airspace at a glance. Here's Class B. Class B starts at the surface and it goes up to the public ceiling. And ceilings can be anywhere from 7,000 feet MSL to I think LA is 12,500. So the ceilings can be kind of a wide variety of ceilings there, but it is always as published on the chart. Class B airspace surrounds the largest and busiest airports, a bunch of them here on the East Coast. And of course, we have New York Class B, which includes Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK. We have Philly, one primary airport. We have Washington, D.C., which is 3 primary airports, right? There's Andrews Air Force Base, there's Dulles and Baltimore, and another Class B in Charlotte, another one in Miami. They're shown on the chart with that solid blue lines. Tops anywhere from 7,000 to 12,000 feet, multiple layers. Each of those areas has its own floor and ceiling, and this is the airspace that requires a clearance to get in, okay? You got to hear the magic words, cleared into Class B airspace. You're talking to the approach control that owns that airspace, and you make a request. The frequencies are on the chart, and you make a request. New York approach, Skyhawk 734 November Alpha is requesting direct to Montauk Point through the Class B at 5,500. There's your request. They come back, say you're cleared through the Class B, 5,000, maintain 5,500, proceed direct Montauk. Okay? But you've got to hear this very specific clearance. Standby doesn't hack it. They come back and acknowledge your call sign, that doesn't hack it in Class B. You need to hear that very specific clearance. As John mentioned, for Class C, it's same. Class B is also an airline-designed airspace. It's designed with the shape and the floors and the altitudes so that jet traffic going in and out of the primary airports is in the Class B. So it's at the surface, in the center of it, and the floors go up and up and up as you get further and further away, and that's where the jets have to be. Their requirement, if they get cleared for visual approach, is to stay above the floor of the Class B. Now, it's not often you get cleared for the visual that far out, but you can expect that the jets are going to be in Class B airspace. Okay? And there's whole separation issues there. Now, all of the airplanes in a Class B are under the control of air traffic control. And so there is an exception for weather. You have to have 3 miles visibility. Okay, that's the same as other general VFR minimums, but you can be down to just clear of clouds as opposed to being 500 feet below the base, 1,000 above, and 2,000 horizontally. 3 miles and clear of clouds is what you need. Now, clear of clouds, you have to be very careful that you can follow their clearance. They've given you a clearance at an altitude, probably given you a heading or a route direct somewhere. And you have to make sure that you can stay clear of clouds and keep at least 3 miles visibility. if you have any doubt about that, you've got to advise them immediately so they can take action for separation. What you don't want to do is fly into a cloud because they've given you clearance to do so. Their clearance is for separation only. It's not intended to be an instrument clearance. So that clear clouds can be an issue. So if you're in Class B airspace and you have any doubt about whether you can keep your 3 miles visibility or clear clouds, you just got to advise them immediately. Generally, you have to be a private pilot to fly into Class B airspace, although there are some exceptions for student pilots, sport pilots, and recreational pilots. You do need a comm radio, and of course you need a transponder with altitude reporting capability. Okay, so we have here the New York Class B airspace. Again, I mentioned there's 3 primary airports. There's Newark, there's LaGuardia, and JFK, and you can kind of see the boundary here is the three circles from those 3 airports. And you can see here that you've also got floors and ceilings in these various areas. There's a floor of 3,000, ceiling of 7. There's the area in Caldwell, which 3,000 foot floor. There's the area with 1,800. So I don't know if you can see this, but if you look down here, there's an area of the Class B airspace. There's the boundary right there. The ceiling is 7,000, and the floor is plus 0.5. Can you see the little plus right there? Kind of an eye test, but the plus 0.5 means the floor of Class B goes down to, but does not include 500. So if Bud were to consider flying his J3 out there, you'd have to be very careful of these floors. Even an airplane without an electrical system can fly below the floor of Class B, but never into Class B. So you'd have to do a really thorough search, and you probably have to decide whether you're comfortable flying over the water to get there. Okay.
Need a Bay West.
It's a Bay West, yeah. Always makes me think of, what was her name? Mae West.
What's he fly for?
I'm not, yeah, really. Okay, so let's go back to that previous slide there, Bill, if you don't mind. So you've got the floors and ceiling of all these parts of the Class B airspace. It's perfectly okay to fly under the floor without a clearance, and it's perfectly okay to fly over the top without a clearance. I would suggest you be at least 500 feet below, keep the air traffic controllers from their consternation, and be at least 500 over the top. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. Here's Philly. Philly airspace changed last year a little bit. It added some airspace here. It added this little part, and it added this little part over here. One primary airport there, that's Philadelphia International. There's other airports here that are below the floor of Class B. There's Philly Northeast, there's Wings Field, there's, what is that one there? Westchester, I guess. So it's perfectly okay to fly below them. No secondary airports that are within the Class B, however, there are those airports that are below Class B. Let's take a look at Washington. Okay, here's the Washington Class B. You've got a lot of different symbols here, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but there's the boundary of the Washington Class B right there. It's that solid blue line. It's got the 3 bumps in it. There's a bump around Dulles. There's a bump here around Andrews Air Force Base, and then another bump here around Baltimore. Very congested airspace. There are some airports here that are within the core area of that Class B airspace, but there's other security issues there, so the overriding concern here is that whole special flight rules area. We've got a slide on that a little bit later. All right, anybody flown into any of the Class B airports in Washington? Yeah. Anybody flown in VFR? Okay. I know we did a class here a while back about flying into Dulles, and we were going to go down on a Saturday to see the Udvar-Hazy Museum, and we had a bunch of people show up for that class, and we talked about all of the issues to get in and out of Dulles safely and easily. And Dave went. I know Dave went on Friday. Actually, he couldn't join us on Saturday, and he and George Frederick boldly launched off where no man had ever gone before to Dulles, and that got everything out of there successfully. It wasn't that hard. The class we did was about an hour brief. It was a step-by-step, almost a checklist of everything you need to do and plan for, and it's really not that hard. So if you get the chance to ever come to a briefing about going in there, why you should do it. It's a lot of fun. Takes the mystery out of it. Yes, sir.
I haven't looked at College Park recently. Can you fly into College Park?
You can. We got a slide on that. That's this other boundary here is the special flight rules area. Can you see these blue lines with the boxes? That's a circle that's 25 miles from the DCA VOR, and that's the special flight rules area where you have to have taken the course and file your flight plans and various things. And this little shape here, which is kind of an irregular shape, is called the flight restricted zone. College Park is in the flight restricted zone, and if you jump through enough hoops, you can get the okay to fly in and out of there. We took a group down and jumped through those hoops. Adam was there, I think. Who else? Dave was there. We went down to Washington. We got fingerprinted. We got interviewed by the FSDO, Baltimore FSDO, which is kind of interesting. They said, well, we need to check your licenses. That's the official reason we had to go down there and be interviewed. The practical reason is they looked at us up and down to see if we were terrorists. They wouldn't even let us into their office, for starters. They interviewed us in the hall. Three inspectors came out. I don't think any of them really understood what they were supposed to do. But they had copies of our certificates, and they finally looked at each other and nodded, and they signed our chit, and off we went. And at the end of the day, we had to watch a security video. At the end of the day, we'd met all the requirements, and a couple weeks later, we got a call from the College Park airport manager with our PIN numbers. And so we can go in there. I've gone in there a lot, actually. And it's not that difficult. Once you learn the procedures, once you have them clearly in your mind, it's file your flight plan, talk to air traffic control, squawk the code they give you, and remain clear of Class B airspace unless you have a specific clearance to enter the Class B. There's your 4 steps. And College Park is there. Yeah. All right. So let's take a look. We'll look at Class A airspace. Sorry, one more slide. Here's the Mode C Vail. This happens to be 30 nautical miles from Philadelphia down near the Yardley. This is a Class D for Trenton. Within 30 miles, you need a transponder with altitude reporting capability. Okay, that's what that symbol looks like on the map there at 30 miles.
Is that at any altitude?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, you could be below Class B, you could be in Class B, you could be above Class B airspace. It's all within 30 miles. You need that transponder. Okay, next one. Class A, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on because none of us can get up there with the exception of some of the airline and military guys. Class A airspace starts at 18,000 MSL and it goes up to flight level 600. It requires airplane B, an IFR flight plan. Air pilot has to be qualified for IFR, have to have an IFR clearance, and be at the altitude that they have assigned. All traffic is on an IFR clearance, and all traffic is provided separation. That's where the A comes from, Class A airspace, altitude, or all. Okay, now Neil flies his airplane, I think, up in Class A airspace, but I can't get up that high. Okay, so we're doing okay to consider. I think we are going to go past 12. If you have to leave, well, I understand that completely, but getting into kind of the interesting stuff here. All right, so special use airspace. We're going to talk briefly about these 5 types of special use airspace. Prohibited areas, restricted warning, MOAs, and alert areas. Okay, next one. So prohibited areas, there's 8 of these in the U.S. You just plain can't fly in there. As the title suggests, you just can't go into a prohibited area, no exceptions. Now, they do have their own lateral and vertical boundaries. And you can easily go around these things, none of them are too big. And in some cases, you can go over the top of them, and they're okay. They have, you can look on the legend on the chart. Every prohibited area has its vertical boundaries and who to call. Not that you can call, you just plain can't go in there. But here's the 3 closest prohibited areas. There's P40 at Camp David, Maryland. There's P56, which is downtown Washington, D.C., and P67 at Kennebunkport, Maine. I mentioned these two because they're the most likely that we deal with, and this one is on the New York sectional chart. These are established for national security in most cases, and there's a few that are just plain hazardous that we wouldn't want to fly into. Now, so I mentioned you can find this information on the legend of the sectional chart. Down at the bottom there, there's a listing of all special use airspace. If there's altitudes that apply, they're listed there. And now, for you for-flight users, if you're looking at your chart and you touch on the prohibited area, a little window pops up and shows you the detail for that. Okay? I'm a for-flight user. Anybody else like for-flight? Okay. How about Garmin Pilot? Anybody like that one? A couple? How about WingX? Some fans for WingX? Okay.
The Garmin Pilot doesn't have all of the information in the window.
Oh, okay. All right, so this is what the symbol looks like for a prohibited area. It's a solid blue line with these hash marks in there. And inside the symbol will be the name of the prohibited area. The same symbol is used for restricted areas and warning areas. And you can tell what it is by looking at the title of that inside. All right. Now, MOA's, can we go back to that? Sorry, Bill. The MOA and alert areas is the same basic symbol except it's magenta. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at P40. This is just north of Washington, D.C. In fact, there's the 30-mile Mode C veil for Washington, D.C. There's Frederick, Maryland, right there. And you can see the dimensions of P40 are right there. Now, the prohibited area itself is 3 miles radius, and it goes up to 4,999 feet. So if you just consider the prohibited area, you can fly over the top of that and not be in the prohibited area if you're 5,000 feet or greater. Okay. Now, there's also a restricted area here that shows it's the exact same lateral boundaries, 3 nautical miles, but it starts at 5,000 and goes up to, well, actually, 12,500, thank you. So here you got, with exactly the same dimensions, a prohibited area that's below 5,000 and a restricted area that starts at 5,000 goes up to 12,500. So we'll talk about restricted areas in a minute. Sometimes you can go in there. So in theory, sometimes you could fly right over the top or flown down this airway many times at 6,000 and gone right close to that prohibited area, right close to the restricted area. Okay. There's also in this area, and you can see the dashed blue lines here, and inside it's kind of a lighter shade. That is the dimensions of a TFR that's issued when the president is at Camp David. And we'll talk about those details there in a little bit. But the prohibited area itself just goes up to 5,000. This is what it looks like in ForeFlight. If you touch on this area, you get information for both P40 and you get information for the restricted area. Okay. So the information that you have on the legend of your sectional chart is all available to you in ForeFlight. Just touch on it, it pops up, and it's right there. I don't know how the rest of you guys are, but I've pretty much given up on paper. The iPad is reliable, it's got everything I need in there, and I'm generally not carrying a paper chart. So, which forced me to figure out where all this information is in ForeFlight. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Here's another prohibited area that's downtown Washington, D.C. This is kind of an interesting one because there's two parts to the P56. There's the part up here, which is the Naval Observatory, which I believe is the Vice President's residence. And then there's an area down here, which is the mall area, the National Mall. One prohibited area, but really in two locations. Both of these go up to 18,000. Okay. Normally you can't get anywhere close, well, you can't get anywhere close to this area because of other security issues. You've got the Washington Special Flight Rules area and you've got the Flight Restricted Zone. Okay, we'll talk more about those a little bit later. Next one. Here's up on the coast of Maine. Here's P67. This is a 1 statute mile radius around the Bush family compound right there. Only goes up to 1,000. So it doesn't affect you much if you're flying up the coast and sightseeing. Just be above 1,000 feet, and you're perfectly okay. Okay. All right. So on to restricted areas. Restricted area is defined as an area where there's certain restrictions to our flights. They can be generally hazardous activity, artillery firing, gunnery, formation flying, flying with lights out. Military does a lot with night vision goggles these days, which means the lights on the airplane, nav lights, are out. They do dogfighting and maybe fire rockets and missiles. So these areas can either be hot or cold. And if you look on the legend of the sectional, they'll oftentimes give hours that that restricted area is expected to be hot. They can be established by NOTAMs at other hours. So you can look at the information on your chart as general planning, but you always want to check during your weather brief or with ATC to see if they're actually hot or actually cold. If they're hot, of course, you have to avoid them. If they're cold, it's okay to fly through them. You will not hear the words cleared through the restricted area. You won't hear it, you don't need it. If it's cold, go on through. If it's hot, well, you just have to avoid it. Okay, within whatever the lateral and vertical boundaries are. So oftentimes these things don't start till they're fairly high up, and they go up to some higher altitude, and it's okay to fly underneath it, or it's okay to fly around it, or if you can get over the top, why, that's okay as well. So you want to check the status during your pre-flight planning, then check again with air traffic control or flight service once you're airborne. Okay, so here's again, we're looking at the same slide around Camp David. The restricted area here goes from 5,000 to 12,500. If that's cold, you can fly through there above 5,000. Okay, boldly go where we're supposed to go. Okay, so we'll talk again about this when we talk about TFRs. All right, so let's look at a couple of local examples. Here's McGuire Air Force Base, and just to the east of it is this restricted area 5001A and B. There's two restricted areas right there. Restricted area 5001A, which includes this little hook right here, is from the surface to 4,000. And B, which is this boundary right here, goes from 4,000 to 8,000. So above 8,000, you can fly right through there with no issues at all. Below 8,000, it'll depend on whether these restricted areas are hot. It's possible that one could be hot and the other cold. It's possible they can both be cold, or they could both be hot, just depending on what's going on there. McGuire Air Force Base here has radar, and they know the status of those restricted areas. You should be able to get a pretty good idea during your pre-flight planning whether those are going to be hot or cold, and then check once you're airborne. Okay? And again, there's no clearance to go through a restricted area. If it's cold, just go right through. Okay? Let's take a look at the next one. This is an area that's just a little bit southeast of McGuire. There's the Jersey Shore right here. And you've got 6 little restricted areas right here that sometimes share a common border, sometimes don't. But they do have each has their own lateral boundary, each has their own vertical boundary. They can be hot or cold independent of any other part. And sometimes it's a little hard to tell which boundary is which. For example, you look at R5002C, well, what are the exact boundaries of that? Sometimes it's not quite so easy to tell. I go into this little Eagle's Nest Airport pretty regularly, and we'll just ask McGuire if any of the R5002s are hot. Generally, they're all cold. So the exact boundary of the vertical dimensions don't matter. They're cold, I can just go right through there. All right? But if it gets to where one of them is, say only one of them is hot, then you have to figure out which one that is, or avoid them all. A question in the back there.
Yeah, Craig, that's only applicable under VFR flight plan, right? Because under IFR, you're just automatic. Once you're cleared for an IFR flight plan, you don't need to know the times because that's taken care of, correct?
Yeah. The question has to do with if you're an IFR flight, do you need to be concerned about this? And the answer is the controllers can clear you through there if it's cold. And they must steer you around it if it's hot. So your clearance will take care of that. Good question.
What about flight following?
Flight following, you can't count on the fact that they're cold. You just need to ask. In fact, I heard a funny conversation on the radio. We're headed down to College Park, and there's a restricted area there just north of Baltimore. And I'm listening to the approach control, and this other airplane is getting its VFR advisories also, and he is headed right for the restricted area. And the controller said, you need to turn left or right now to avoid the restricted area. And the pilot came back and said, I was counting on you to do that. And he said it in a real funny way. The pilot obviously didn't understand that the fact he was getting flight following would keep him clear of restricted areas. No, the controller, to his credit, saved a deviation by telling this guy, hey, you got to turn, you can't go in there, it's hot. But the guy was talking to the controller and could have easily asked him, is it hot or is it cold? If it's hot, hey, you got to avoid it. If it's cold, press on. So, but IFR, to answer the question in the back, if you're IFR, you can just follow your clearance. You don't really get involved in it with a lot of these airspace issues. The controllers deal with them, of course, but they kind of take care of that for us. It's like when we talk about gathering a group to go into Washington, there's always half the people going, I'm going IFR because it's too hard to go VFR. Say, wait a minute, the class we're doing here, the briefing is to get in there VFR. Okay? And so we learn what we can do to go in VFR. And VFR is oftentimes a lot easier. You can go direct, you're not delayed on the ground waiting for a clearance, you're not being vectored who knows where. And so I like to fly IFR. I've loved instrument flying since I got my rating, 1969. And I love the intricacies of flying IFR. But I tell you, there's plenty of times where it is just flat easier to go VFR. And that's why we're here, right? Learn the rules for flying VFR. So anyway, next slide. I talked a little bit in the slide previous about how hard it is sometimes to figure out what these boundaries. This is that same restricted area, 5002. And on my little Garmin Era, I can zoom in on this. I can touch that area on the Era, and it pops up and shows exactly where 5002C is. I think the iPad does the same thing. I think the other portables do the same thing. But technology can help sometimes figure out where these boundaries are. Each part can be selected independently, and the lateral boundary pops up, and then the vertical is in the box there also. Okay? All right, let's move on to warning areas. Warning areas are, and we've got a bunch of them right here. In fact, we're kind of lucky here in New Jersey when you think of it. We have almost every bit of this restricted area close to us. We have prohibited, we have warning, we have alerts. Everything is right here, so we get to play with it. It's what? It's a good experience, yep. Builds character, as my mom used to say. But we are kind of lucky that we have close by examples. If we lived in the middle of nowhere, it would be more theoretical. Here it's more practical, right? Because we deal with these things all the time. In fact, every flight we plan, every flight we fly, we're always dealing with airspace issues. So I hope this is valuable to you, talking about all this stuff. Anyway, warning areas. There are some just offshore here. They're in international waters. They have the same hazards as restricted areas: artillery fire, guided missiles, rockets, stuff that can really hurt you. So it's the same types of issues that you have in restricted areas. They have certain lateral and vertical boundaries. They're shown on the TAC charts. The vertical boundaries are, and the hours of operation are shown in the legend of the sectional chart, or you can touch on it before flight and figure those out. Some have very specific hours. Others just say the hours are effective by NOTAM. ATC can still tell you whether that warning area is hot or cold. If it's cold, you know there's no hazards out there. If it's hot, yeah, you can still fly in there if you want. It's international waters. The FAA will not restrict your flight activities in international airspace. Okay? So you can fly into that area even if it's hot. Is it a good idea? No. If it's hot, I'd stay out of there. Okay, I don't want to see missiles zinging by me. Okay, so that's warning areas. I think we have a slide of a warning area. Yeah. Here we go. Yes, sir. Yes. Is that official terminology? I thought so, but yeah. Anyway, everybody understands it, so. What's that? Tally ho and no joy, no joy, right, okay. So here's a warning area right here. You can see the boundary. It's that red solid line with the magenta hatch marks in it. This happens to be warning area 106A. Oh, let's see. Yeah, sorry, my note, I got an error in my notes. The details are on the sectional chart. This one is intermittent by NOTAM. And if and when it's effective, it goes from the surface to 1,999 feet. We'll say. So could you fly out there? You can always fly out there. You can't, you're not prohibited from flying into a warning area, but if that's active, I wouldn't go in there myself. Okay. So, international waters. The international waters used to be 3 miles offshore. Now it's 12 miles offshore. You'll still see some warning areas that use the 3-mile offshore boundary, but legally now the international is now out to 12 miles. So while we're looking at this chart, you can see there's another warning area which can have its own hours of operation, its own altitudes. But while we're looking at this, let's just look at a few other things that we've already talked about. You can see this boundary right there. Remember what that one is? That represents a change in the floor of Class E airspace. So here you've got Class E airspace. Let's see, is it on here? Well, now this is not the floor. That's maximum elevation figure. That's as high as you're going to find terrain or obstacles. So that's definitely not the floor of Class. Yeah, I'm not sure this slide goes out far enough to. Where do you see that? Okay, yeah. But it's not shown on this particular slide, but there is a change of the Class B. On this side, I can tell you it's 1,200 feet above the ground or above sea level. Here, it's some other published value that I don't quite see what it is, okay? 1,700 above, okay. Yeah, where do you see that? I'm not seeing it. Oh, there it is right there. Okay, good, thank you. So there's the floor of Class E airspace in this whole area, this side of this boundary. So below that is Class G airspace with lesser required weather. Above the floor here of Class E, it's 500 below, 1,000 above, 2,000 horizontally, 3 miles visibility. So a couple of other things we've talked about here already. There's the Mode C for Kennedy. There is the Class B boundary with the floor and the ceiling of that part of the Class B. There is the magenta vignette, and on the soft side of that vignette, you have Class E airspace that goes down to 700. Above that, you're in Class E. You need basic VFR. Below that, why you're in Class G, and the weather requirements are relaxed a little bit there. Okay? So we don't deal with warning areas all that often. I mean, I don't go offshore, so, but gives you an idea what they are. All right, next one we'll talk about MOAs, military, oh, sorry, whoops. For some reason or other, my notes here aren't quite agreeing with the slides. I don't quite understand that. Let's see here if I have one. Anyway, as long as we're on this slide, this of course is Long Island, Connecticut up in here. You've got the warning areas we already talked about, but you've got this boundary right here. That's the ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone. These are always offshore, and the ADIZ generally surrounds the U.S. and it's for defense purposes. Okay, so if you happen to be out here for some reason or other, in order to cross that ADIZ coming back into the U.S., you have to be on a flight plan, be squawking a code, and be communicating with ATC. That's so they can keep track of who is coming into the U.S. Okay? All right, next one should be a MOA. Here's the symbol for a MOA, Military Operations Area. It's the solid red or magenta line with the hash marks inside, and the name of that particular MOA is in the box. The details for those MOAs are all on the legend of the chart, or if you're in ForeFlight, well, you can touch on that and it will bring up those details. I love ForeFlight. MOAs can contain, you can go to the next slide if you would, Bill. Here's one that's in northern New York, up in the Adirondacks. This particular MOA is the Tupper South MOA. There's Tupper North here, and I forget what this is a different MOA, this is a different MOA. You can get the details on the legend of the chart, or if you happen to be in ForeFlight, you can touch on it, it will bring up the details. This one's 6,000 feet up to 17,999. New York National Guard owns that. MOAs can contain things like dogfighting, aerobatics, abrupt maneuvering, lights out. Flights are allowed in there. Each of them has their own specific lateral and vertical boundaries. They can overlap. You can have a MOA, one that's down low, another one that's directly above it in altitude. Good idea to check during your pre-flight to see if these MOAs are going to be hot. And it's a really good idea once you're en route to check and make sure they're hot also. Although there is no restriction to flying in these things. At your own risk, you can fly through them even if they're hot. I don't recommend that. Okay. Now these are described as either hot or cold. If they're cold, there's no military activity in there, and you can go through without worrying about what's happening there. If they're hot, you can still go through there. There's no clearance required. One interesting thing in a MOA is that all pilots are equally responsible for collision avoidance. So if there's military airplanes in there doing dogfighting, they still have a responsibility to be looking out for us as traffic. We certainly have a responsibility to be looking out for them. But they can be going the speed of heat, and tell you what, they cover a lot of ground in a very short distance. And the whole see and avoid thing doesn't work that well. So I personally don't go through there unless it's cold. This is, again, a plug for flight following. If you're getting flight following, you're already talking to the guy who can tell you whether it's hot or cold. Sometimes they don't use the entire MOA. They might not use the lower half of the altitudes in a MOA. They're only using the upper part. So if you're going through the lower half, well, you're okay. Did I see a hand? Yes, Brent.
Is that frequency of 35, 65, is that telling you
You can ask that fellow, and they'll know whether it's hot or cold. On the other hand, if you're getting advisories, you're already talking to the guy who knows. So I start asking pretty far out whether it's hot. If it's hot, then I can make my deviation early, not add so many miles to my flight. Okay? So.
You had a question before in the back about when your IFR going through a restricted area when it's not hot. Interestingly enough, you can go through this VFR when it's active. But you can't go through an IFR when it's active.
Right.
In fact, you can't go within 3 miles of it when it's active because they can't guarantee 3-mile separation. I had a situation a number of years ago where I was trying to do some furniture avoidance and stir up along the edge of an active tunnel, which I knew I couldn't go in IFR. But they wouldn't let me get that close to it.
Oh, interesting.
They couldn't guarantee the 3-mile separation between what might be going on inside.
Don makes a good point here. And he flies to Florida a lot, and there's areas in North and South Carolina where the MOAs are huge, so it becomes an issue. Don reminds us that if you're on an instrument flight, ATC can clear you through these when they're cold on your instrument flight plan, but not when they're hot. And he says they can't even let you get within 3 miles of the border on an IFR flight plan if the MOA is hot, because they need to provide that 3-mile separation. In fact, for your own navigation, even as great and as accurate as our GPSs are, don't get close to these boundaries. Give yourself a couple miles to be outside the boundaries so there's no question that you're well clear. I had a case going down through the New York Class B where I showed that I was a mile outside, and I was skirting along the edge, and the controller said on his scope it looked like I would go into the area. Okay, I don't even want to try and defend that, so I just scooted out and gave myself even more distance around it. So don't cut it right too close. Okay. Okay. Let's go on to the next one is alert areas. Same symbol as the MOAs, except it's the A tips you off that it's an alert area. These are generally established for high pilot training areas. Now, concentrated student helicopter training, I don't know what that brings to your mind, but that seems like an out-of-control situation. Hey, we have any helicopter pilots in here? So, not that there's anything wrong with that. Okay? high volume of student training or other high performance activity. There's no requirement to communicate to go through an alert area. It is simply there to alert us to the fact that there's lots of activity. There's no requirement to go into that area, no communications, no clearance. Okay? Now we'll take a look at an example. Again, we have a close by example. There's the alert with the red line with the hash marks. This is down around McGuire. McGuire does a ton of training down there, and there's oftentimes multiple jets in their pattern doing training. So this alert area, A220, is effective up to 4,500 feet. Okay, just tells you that's where the activity is. There's no need to call them. There's certainly no clearance to go through there. Is it a good idea to call them? Yeah, I do. I call McGuire Approach 2515, I think is their frequency. Anytime I'm in the area, I like to be talking to them. And I like that they know who I am and where I am and what I'm planning to do also. All right, but you can see its boundaries right there. On the surface, that looks like a pretty complicated area to fly through. But when you break it down one by one, like there's Class D, okay, communication requirement to fly into Class D. There's a restricted area, could be hot or cold. Approach control or the tower can tell you whether it's hot or cold. If it's cold, you can go right through there. The alert area is just to tell you that there's a high volume of traffic. So how difficult is it? Most of the time, it's not too difficult to fly through there and to go where you want and to be able to fly the most efficient direct flight that you can. It's one of the benefits of learning all this. You got Philly Class B area right there up to 4,000. You can see the magenta vignette there. That's Class E airspace down to 700 feet. On the other side of that vignette, it's Class E airspace from 1,200 feet above the surface. So really, when you break these things down, it's not that difficult to figure out what your real requirements are. I hope you're feeling that way. I hope you're feeling like, yeah, okay, you can deal with these things and look at each of these bits of airspace one at a time and kind of figure out what's okay and what isn't.
Last quarter, they ran through the wire a few months ago. The controllers did mention that there's a lot of equipment flying there well above the 250 knot speed limit, and below 10,000 feet. He said, so it's good to talk to us because we want to know what's going on. Apparently, they don't have to adhere to the 250.
That's not any feature of an alert area. Restricted area, yes. But the alert area, that's just to tell you there's a high volume of traffic. Yep. Well, that's news. It's not in the official definition of an alert area. Okay, there's 37 alert areas in our 50 states. So you do see these every once in a while, generally where there's military bases and a lot of training happening. There's a ton of them in the Florida Panhandle. I don't know if you've ever gone through there east to west. There's where IFR truly is easier. There's an airway that kind of cuts through the middle of them. Every time I file for that airway, I get the airway, and I guess I'm a little more at ease. Okay, let's move on. So we'll talk about a couple of other types of airspace, temporary flight restrictions and terminal radar service areas. Temporary flight restrictions are established by NOTAM. That's an important thing to know, because if you are in your pre-flight planning stage and you ask for NOTAMs, if there's TFRs out there, they're going to tell you, because every TFR is established by NOTAM. Certain lateral and vertical boundaries and effective hours. The TFRs are not, because of the nature of them being temporary, they're not shown on any of our paper charts. But if you happen to have avionics that displays things like weather, like I happen to have subscription to XM weather on my portable Garmin, TFRs will show up there. In fact, there's a huge one around Philly. It's a big, big yellow circle, and you can tap on that on the Garmin, and it will bring up real-time information about that TFR. Some of the panel-mounted avionics have the downloads for that also. Restrictions are thoroughly described, and you have to read it carefully. I like to read it, study it myself before I call for the weather brief, and that way the controller either confirms my understanding or he fixes my understanding. I've had both happen. So get a good weather brief. It's another great reason for flight following. I know I keep plugging flight following. There's just a ton of benefits to be talking to either the approach control as area you're in or to center. Okay? So we have one here on the sporting events. As you know, anytime you've got sporting events, let's move on to the next one, Bill. There's standing TFR for sporting events. Starts an hour before to an hour after the actual event. Certain seating capacity, certain types of games, you have these temporary flight restrictions. They're within 3 miles of the stadium and 3,000 feet. So there's a standing TFR that covers all of these events. So it's up to us to know where the stadiums are and whether games are being played. As far as I know, Flight Service doesn't keep track of that and can't tell you if there's going to be an event.
So I wanted to say something on that. If you do the New York corridor, no way you're going to know if you talk to air traffic control if the Yankee thing.
Yes, my understanding.
Before we check Yankee, but even still, there's no way you'll know. Other than that.
I don't believe there is.
You get busted for that very reason.
Sometimes they'll guide you. You guys with that one?
Well, we had a necessity group.
No, we were coming back from,
Toronto? Rock Island, sounds like?
we were coming back from that direction, and you wanted to go through the corridor at that time. You asked for the transition, and they told you at that point that there was going to be a game going on, that maybe it's not a good idea at this time.
Well, when they say it's not a good idea, I listen to that.
Well, we then
Okay. So anyway, you just have to be careful of these. And remember, all of these TFRs are established by NOTAM. But here's a NOTAM right here that is in effect all the time and basically puts the burden on us to know where these games are and to be able to avoid. All right, let's move on. All right, here's back to Camp David. There's our prohibited area. There's our restricted area. And this dashed blue line is where TFRs are issued when the president is at Camp David. And the NOTAM establishes this TFR. Generally, it's the boundaries on the chart here. There's an inner core of 5 miles, which would be right here. These are 3 miles radius. There's a 5-mile inner core, which you cannot go in, according to the TFR. And between 5 and 10 miles, you can go in if you get permission from air traffic control. Have to be on a flight plan, be squawking, be talking, that kind of thing. All right, so if the TFR is in effect, just read it carefully. Now, one thing here, this is commonly referred to when the TFR is issued as it's expanding P40 or expanding this restricted area. That's a misnomer. The P40 and R409 are always a radius of 3 miles. There's a TFR that establishes another area that's bigger, but it does not really expand P40 or R4009. So you hear that language, but the prohibited area, restricted area really don't change their dimension. Okay, next one, Bill. So terminal radar service areas. These are established around airports that are busy, but not as busy as a Class C airport, but who offer radar services. They're shown on the chart as a solid black line. Some similarities with Class B airspace. It's the same general shape. They have shelves and altitudes. But there's some real differences from Class C airspace. And the difference is that the radar service is voluntary. In Class C, you have to establish communication with the controller, and they're going to provide radar service. In this area, radar service is completely voluntary. You can fly in and only call the tower. And the other difference is these terminal radar service areas do have a Class D embedded in the terminal radar service area. And that Class D is mandatory. Remember, that's established communication. All right, let's take a look at a slide for that. Oh, I will tell you also that years ago, these were called airport radar service areas. And the intent at that time was all of these old airport radar service areas would become Class C airspace. Some of them didn't make the cut. They didn't have enough traffic. So these terminal radar service areas are hangers-on from old airspace that it's voluntary. Okay, what can I tell you? All right, so here's a terminal radar service area up at Wilkes-Barre. And you can see the boundaries here in this black line, or it actually looks kind of dark gray. And it's divided into sectors here also. This one goes up to 6,000. And there's a sector here that with a floor of 3,900. You'll find other sectors here that get closer and closer to the ground. But notice this one does have Class D. So all of the stuff out here as far as talking to radar, that's voluntary. But the requirement to establish communications before entering the Class D is mandatory. Okay? There's other terminal radar service areas close by Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Elmira, New York, and Binghamton, New York. Okay? A couple of other interesting things. Here you've got Class D, you've got, there's the magenta vignette that tells you that the floor of Class E airspace is 700 feet. Outside the vignette, the floor of Class E airspace is 1,200 feet. There's also, it's a little hard to see here, there's a Class E surface extension right there. Can you see it? Dashed red line. That brings controlled airspace down to the surface and adds a requirement for basic VFR weather minimums in that area. No communications requirement. That's only in Class D. I think there's another surface extension right there. Dashed red line. Okay. Okay. So let's move on to the next one. The special flight rules areas. We've got a couple of them close by. These are established in FAR 93. You can read as much as you want about these in FAR 93. There's different subparts in FAR 93 for each of these special flight rules areas. They're national security or sometimes just congestion. National security is the case in Washington, D.C. And I think my pointer is fading out here. Anyway, congested traffic areas, that's the New York special flight rules area that allows up and down the Hudson River. These special flight rules areas are shown with this kind of a symbol, solid blue line with the boxes attached to it. Okay. Special online training is sometimes required for these, and sometimes there's limits on airspeeds and other procedures. Here's where the special flight rules areas exist in the U.S. And we'll talk briefly about the New York and Washington. Okay, next one. Here's the back of the New York TAC chart, which describes the New York Special Flight Rules area. And basically, here's the Hudson River. And if you haven't, has anybody done this? Done the, okay, certain number of people? It's great, isn't it? I love doing this. We've got out-of-town company and they want to go for an airplane ride. That's the first thing I ask them about. But this allows flight below the Class B airspace up and down the river. It's an absolutely great thing to do. There is an online course to take, but it's not required. But it is required that you have this chart with you and you follow the procedures that are on the chart. And a few of the limits there, you can be at or above 1,000 feet, MSL up to 1,299 feet. The northbound flights are on the east part of the river and the southbound flights are on the west part of the river. Speed limit is 140 knots. Lights have to be on. And there's 6 landmarks where you broadcast your position as you go by these landmarks. Common frequency 12305. I think it's a helicopter frequency. And you're basically broadcasting your position for the benefit of other airplanes that are out there. Try to keep track of where they are. There's also an option, and it's described over here, as to go down, up and down the river in the Class B between 1,300 MSL and 2,000. So I kind of like doing that because I'm a little bit above the riffraff. It's over here. So I will oftentimes ask for clearance through the Class B. It may be 1,500 or 2,000. And most of the time I get it. And so I kind of like that. I've done it many times both ways. We had a funny thing happen here when the Cessna 120, 140 group had their national meeting here. We offered to do a briefing for them to do the Hudson flight. And got very excited about that. Almost everybody decided to do it. But the UN General Assembly was having their meeting. Okay? And that we were planning to go northbound along the river, fly down here over the Raritan Bay and then come up northbound. Well, wouldn't you know, that TFR extended from the UN building to halfway into the Hudson River. halfway. At first I thought, well, there's no way we can do this. On the other hand, I thought, you know what, if we come southbound through the river and we're diligent about staying on the west part of the river, we can do this. And so we had, I don't know, 25, 30 Cessna 140s about a mile apart coming down the river. And there were no violations, so everybody was pretty much on the west side of the river. We did get a call from Caldwell Tower thinking that somebody in our group cut the corner and went through their Class D without a clearance. But they couldn't figure out who it was. So we denied it, of course. And the pilots at the I happened to be in the very first airplane. I'm off here. Am I back on? Okay. The guy, the tail end Charlie, he denied ever going through there. So no paperwork was filed. We called approach control to tell them what we were doing. We called Newark Tower, tell them what we're doing. We called LaGuardia Tower, tell them what they're doing. They suggested we call the New York City Helicopter Department, tell them what we're doing. Everybody knew what we were doing, and it turned out to be just a great flight. Well, the question is this available on ForeFlight? And yes, it's available. Is it? I think it's the document download. There's a menu of documents you can download in a ForeFlight. This is one of them. This is the back side of the TAC chart. All right, so let's take a look at the next one. Here's the Washington Special Flight Rules area. And again, the boundary is this solid blue line with the boxes on it, 25 miles radius of the DCA VOR. And in order to go in there, you have to have done the online training and carry your graduation certificate with you. Okay? That's required if you're flying VFR within 60 miles of the Washington VOR. They recommend that you go through the online training and carry your certificate if you're within 100 miles. But you have to have it with you if you're within 60 miles. Okay? So you've got other issues here, notably the Class B. So if you're going to fly in here and you're going to fly in VFR, you've got to satisfy all the requirements for the Special Flight Rules area, which is file a flight plan, talk to ATC, squawk their code, and the fourth is remain below the floor of Class B, unless you get a particular clearance to go in there. Okay? Anybody done this? Anybody gone into Gaithersburg or any of these other airports? John has, okay. Others have, okay. Anybody want to do this? Anybody curious enough to come to a briefing and actually fly your plane down in there? Anybody pull? Okay, well, maybe do that. It's a very fun brief. We went into Annapolis, Maryland one time, went to the boat show, which was a lot of fun. It's not that much more difficult operationally to go into the freeze. Like College Park is relatively easy. So it's all the same procedures to fly into the SFRA, with the exception that you have to call Leesburg for your weather brief, and you have to give them your PIN, which identifies you as somebody who's gone through the whole process to get certified to go in there. Operationally, it's the same thing. File your flight plan, talk to ATC, squawk their code, and stay below the floor of Class B. Don't screw up either. I mean, okay? That's probably the unwritten rule. A few things like you can't turn your transponder off. Like if you're inside of the field, I guess it's not my habit, but it is for some people to turn their transponder off. You don't ever want to do that. That definitely gets their attention. Yeah. Your only defense is to show them a smoking, burned-up transponder.
And it's a good idea to have it on in Class G also, because TCAS won't see you, and now the ADSB guys won't see you if you turn off the transponder.
Right.
I run into that every time.
Right. Good point there. There is a section that says if you have a working transponder, it should be on irrespective of where you are. So I don't want to minimize that. All right, so there's a special flight. There's a whole, this is a whole different, whole other course. We don't have time to go into too much detail about this, but there is the online course. If you're at all curious, go on, take the course. That'll give you a pretty good idea what needs to be done. Yes, sir.
About, like, you're doing that trip down there, how do you find out you're doing it? Is that available? Is that through your EAA or through?
We have done it through the EAA, and we've also announced it on the airport email. The Sky Manor Airport sends out an email every month, and we will put it in there. So if you happen to sign up for the email, we'd be happy to add you onto it, and that's how you know. Okay, next slide. There's our flight restricted zone. Again, this is additional requirements to fly into these 3 airports. There's College Park. This is Potomac Airport and Hyde Park Executive right there. This one here, Freeway, is just outside the flight restricted zone. You can see a little bit of a cutout right there. All right, so how are we doing on time? You guys okay? I got one more thing we could consider, and that's just consider a cross-country flight. Yeah, well, actually, John's going to talk also. But if you want to take just 5-minute break, I've got to get the iPad set up into the projector, and then we'll come back and consider a flight from Ocean City, New Jersey, 26 November to Poughkeepsie. So if you have your iPad or your portable GPS, put that in, 26 November to this part. All right? This is where I get to answer the questions, and I get to ask the questions, and you get to answer. All right, so we're starting here at Ocean City, New Jersey, and we're considering a flight that will go right up through this way toward Poughkeepsie. Now, the first question here, and let me change the screen here just a little bit. Our flight doesn't take us through there, but consider this warning area right here. What would it take for us to fly into that warning area? Well, a broken iPad. That's right. Our auto flight isn't in there, but I just want to remember that warning area is there's hazardous activities in there. You can see on the legend of the chart the typical hours of operation and altitude, or you could also talk to approach control, which in this case would be Atlantic City approach. Okay? Well, how about this boundary right here? What is that? Whoops, I kind of gave it away there, didn't I? But what is that? Change of the floor of Class E airspace, right? The floor on this side of the boundary is 1,700 MSL. On this side would be 1,200 AGL. There's the magenta. What does it tell you inside the magenta? What does it tell you there about weather? Class E goes down to 700 feet, okay? Below 700 feet, you're in Class G airspace, and above that, you're in Class E, and you need the basic VFR weather minimums, okay? All right, how about this boundary right here? That solid magenta boundary, what does that tell you? Class Charlie, okay, and what does it take to get into Class Charlie? Establish communication, okay? So you've only got a couple miles here before you get to the outer boundary, but what altitude is effective here for the Class C? Okay, floor is 1,300 right there, right? So can you take off and head along your magenta line and stay below 1,300 before you establish communication? Yes, you sure can. Once you establish communication, can you just climb through the Class C airspace en route? Yes, you can, unless he tells you to do something different. You've established communication, and you can proceed on course. Okay? I'm going to slide the map down here just a little bit. Now, notice in Class C airspace, there is no Class D. That Class C airspace goes all the way to the surface, and that handles the tower. Okay? So next bit of airspace is this one right here. You got R 5002 A and B. What about going on this line? What would we have to do or want to do? Find out whether it's hot or cold, okay? Atlantic City approach here can tell you, and they're going to hand you off to McGuire approach at some point here. You can ask either one, but one way or another, just find out if that's hot or cold. If they're cold, how are we affected? You're not. You can just go right through it. If they're hot, well, you're going to have to change course a little bit here. deviate a little bit to the west. Okay? So the next airspace we run into is right here. Whoops, my pointer is getting a little harder to turn on. There's the boundary of what kind of airspace is that? Alert area. And what does it take for us to fly into that alert area? Nothing, right? Not a bad idea to be talking to approach control so you know what's going on in there, but there is no requirement to talk to them. Okay? There's another restricted area, the same issue there. It's either, well, we're going to miss it. It might be a little too close for comfort. I think I'd probably skirt around to the east a little bit more to make sure I was well clear of that area. And how about this? What airspace is that right there? Class D, and what's the requirement to get into that? Established communication. If we were going over the top, how high would we have to go to be over the top of that? 2,600, okay? Okay, that's good. Man, you guys have been paying attention. I'm proud of you. Okay, next on up the line here, how about this solid magenta line right here? Mode C veil, and it requires a transponder, okay? How about this boundary right here? Okay, floor is 3,000, okay? 3,000 to 7,000. Could you be up in here at 2,500? Yeah, you could. You have to be thinking ahead to what's up here, though. Don't want to be surprised by going into a boundary here where you're okay at 2,500, another boundary where you're not. Okay, scoot the map down here a little bit. There's Newark Airport. We go right over the top of Newark. So what are the issues here with Class B? What do we need to fly into Class B airspace? Got to have a clearance, right? You got to hear those magic words. Cleared into Class B at a certain altitude, or cleared into Class B, climb and maintain such and such an altitude. How about if we're a fast climbing airplane, how high would we want to be to go over the top of Class B? Yeah, the top is, the Class B goes up to and including 7,000. So you could be at 7,001 foot to be legal, but I suggest at least 500 foot. Okay, keep the controllers happy. All right, so let's scoot the map down here just a little bit. You see the edge of Class B airspace right there. There's your Mode C veil. And the next thing we run across here is this restricted area. That's our 5206. That's at West Point. And we can, I'm touching on the screen here to try and bring up, there's the details for our 5206. Surface to 5,000. So if,
Craig, if you activate your VFRs, if you're live now, it'll show it. We're playing a game.
oh, okay. Is it? Where? Oh, is that right? Did that show up on our test list?
No, your top left.
Okay. So we'd have this restricted area to be concerned with if we deviate a little bit off course to the left. Okay? Up to 5,000. Okay, so there's Poughkeepsie. And how about, what's that, the dash blue line there? Okay, Delta, what does it take to get into Delta? Oh man, you guys are good. All right, I'm going to scoot the map up to the northwest here. I know you can't see what I'm doing on the screen, but just moving it up to the northwest. There's a, here we go, there's what I wanted to take a look at right there. What kind of airspace have we got here? MOA. And how does that affect our flight? Hot or cold? You can fly into it whether it is hot or cold. If it's cold, you know there's no issue. If it's hot, you're taking your chances flying in. Okay? A lot of people are very comfortable doing that. I'm not knocking them. I'm just not one of them. Okay, I want to either know it's cold or I'm going around it. Okay? So there is a ceiling to those. Let me touch on it here in ForeFlight, see if we can bring it up. There's the details on the Lowville MOA. It's 100 feet AGL to 17,999. Okay? Yeah. You're a brave guy if you're going below that one. All right, so let me just move Watertown into view here. Okay. we've got a, well, this is interesting. This is a uncontrolled airport, right? You can, kind of hard to see the airport symbol, but it's magenta. How about this line right here, that dashed red line? What does that tell us? Floor of Class E goes all the way to the surface. So that's a weather requirement. That says if you're going to fly in there, you've got to have your basic VFR weather minimums come in there. There's no communication requirement to get in there. There's no Class D, there's no tower, nobody you really have to talk to. There will be a CTAF right there, but no tower. Okay? So just to say a few words to sort of sum things up, we've looked at a lot of airspace rules and procedures, and these are important for our safety, to keep us legal, for our confidence in being out there knowing what we're doing, and basically to have more fun if we know what we're doing. So John's going to come up and talk to us. Any questions for him? It's an option. Just go into settings and turn them on. I kind of like them, but I don't think they're there by default. You need to unplug that, Bill? Are you going to put John's slides in there? There you go. Take us just a second.
Well, to start talking now, I guess.
Craig's topic was airspace review. I figured, well, how can I tag on to the back into that? So,
You need a mic, John? Can you speak up? Can you guys hear?
I'll try. Oh, we get started. We're good. Forward.
All right, that worked? Okay. So I'm going to so I'll just pick up on the concept of airspace, but looking at it from an air traffic point of view. Just go to show. There you go. Next one. All right, this is what it looks like from our point of view. That great big jigsaw puzzle is our airspace. I never thought of it as funny, but I guess I suppose it could be. Allentown's in the middle. Those dotted lines represent the extended center lines of Allentown's runways. And those, as long as I'm explaining it, these little lines are 1 mile long each. And the distance between them is 1 mile long. So here you are. We're out at Sky Manor. We've got Sky Manor. We've got Alexandria right up here. You're in the corner of our airspace. And we depict nav aids as circles. I labeled those for you. And you can see we abut New York airspace, so when Bill's caught up there, we'll go to the next slide. All right, so depending on when you take off out of one of these airports, if you're going southwest bound, you can call us right off the ground as soon as you leave the pattern if you'd like. We don't mind. But, you know, for simplicity's sake, if you're going southwest bound down here toward Pottstown, you're going to be in Philadelphia's airspace within about 6 miles. If you want to go right to them, you can, or if you want to establish communications with us, we'll hand you off to Philly. One more. On our side of the line, we divide our altitudes by 3,000 feet and below and above 3,000. Out in this corner of the airspace, we own, in other words, Allentown delegated airspace, we own surface to 5,000. We don't own 6, 7, and 8 until you get inside that next line. So above 3,000, our frequency is 2445. Next one. And if you're going to go the other way, New York approach, generally right off, if you just take off east out of the pattern, you're in the metro sector, and their primary frequency is 32.8. So those are frequencies you can use for advisories. Okay? We talked about flight following and kind of, you know, promoting it a little bit. Just to give you an idea of what's happening over top of our airspace. That purple line comes across the Allentown VOR at about 13,000 feet, And they level off at 10,000 feet. And those are jets going into... And that's a flow of jets going into LaGuardia Airport. If you jump up parallel to that, the green flight, by the time they cross the Broadway VOR, they're descending out of 7,000 feet, and that's a line of jets going into Newark Airport. If you jump up to the orange line, which is just off the edge, there's a double flow, a high flow and a low flow. The low flow is going across Stillwater VOR at 6,000 feet, and they're primarily going into Teterboro, and they're almost all corporate jets. And high above that, up in the 20 to 19,000 range, is you got the jets going into Kennedy. Just to keep you an idea of like, if you think, well, I'll skirt the New York area kind of on the northwest side, you do that, you're skirting the Class B, but you're running into all these flows. So I'm just kind of promote flight following in general. Okay. Next slide. As far as the altitudes we can see, I called New York Approach and I double-checked with them, just, you know, in the area of here and out towards Solberg VOR. They can generally pick you up when you get up about 3,000 feet, maybe a little lower. You would probably, if you're used to doing that, you probably already know the answer to where they can see you and know where they'll call you radar contact. Allentown, as of about 6 months ago, we are one of the most technologically advanced small facilities in the country right now with what we've got. Of course, the day after that happened, it probably changed. But right now, we have 3 radar feeds on a continuous basis, one of which is a long-range radar that's down around Camden, New Jersey, and that shoots up over here to the lower terrain. I can actually see you. I spent time in approach control yesterday. I wanted to see how low I could feel. I watched somebody come in straight into final, and I lost them at 900 feet, MSL. Here. But we're not going to hang on to you and start calling traffic in your pattern for you. So we still want to terminate service for you 5 or more miles out and let you get over onto your Unicom frequency. Okay? What do I got? Absolutely. Absolutely. So we know what pattern you went into, and we can watch, oh, he left the pattern. He just went down when he flew away again. And next one, what do you got? IFR approaches. All right, you have 2 RNAV approaches in here that are relatively new. How many IFR pilots? Okay, good. Well, the tentative date is January 8th. We're going to add a pair of parallel ones in Alexandria, just like the 2 you got here. RNAV 28 and 26 over there. And right now, the westbound ones, as you know, and Alexandria's will be the same, are going to be operated by New York Approach. We operate the eastbound ones to 8 and 7, so we got to communicate like mad, back and forth, as to, you know, who does what. And typically what they agreed upon is when they run the other one approaches, they'll hand you off to Allentown, we'll take the handoff, they'll switch you to us, and we're looking for your cancellation of IFR. Because technically both the airports are in our airspace. The airports belong to us geographically. What do you got next? IFR clearances. Because you're on the edge of the airspace here, and remember the picture that I showed you, when we get you off the ground on an IFR clearance, we need to get you radar established and climbing in our airspace. We hand you off, if you're going eastbound into New York Approach's airspace, or even southbound into Philly's airspace, both of them, we hand you off to them at 5,000 feet. We need a chance to get you up to 5,000 feet. For example, New York coming across Solberg, they may give us a feed at 4,000 feet. So we need room to get you up over 1,000 feet above that potential traffic. Philadelphia has a feed coming up from Yardley toward Allentown at 4,000. We need a chance to get you up, rather than, it's like, yeah, but it's not the direction I want to go. We got that. You know, the quicker you climb, the quicker we're going to get you ahead. But what we can do is we can put you on a vector to kind of like parallel our airspace boundaries and while you're climbing. And then when the next, be it New York or be it Philly, looks at it and says, okay, I'm good with that, they'll take the handoff, we'll just shoot you toward the next VOR or whatever it is to get you on course. What do we got next? Pop-up clearances. I asked this question of New York and it's like, no. They generally don't work for us because in this northeast corridor, our airspace is so complex, based on where you want to go, the speed of your aircraft, based on so many things, is dependent on the route and the altitude that you're going to get. And we don't expect you to know all those unless you do the same trip in repetition over and over again. So we need a chance to get those clearances straightened out on the ground. And generally, Murphy's Law says you're going to come off the ground and you're going to request a clearance in the air at the most inopportune time when we're trying to pull some other crap apart. So generally, pop-up clearances do not work well for us. There is a situation, and it doesn't, I asked how often this happens. Because you're on the boundary, we have, if you're departing on an eastbound runway, we have to get New York approach control to block that airspace all the way, roughly over to Solberg. But they might be using that piece of airspace for an approach into Solberg or Somerset or even Princeton. But we don't have quite the volumes of traffic that we had 10 years ago. So I've asked, they're telling me that doesn't happen too often. So anybody getting any delays out of here getting an IFR clearance? Okay, so I won't say any more about that. I think that's all I had. Yeah, I mean, you can go back up one slide and leave those topics up. I'll just take questions. Anything you got?
Any advice on, you go to Boston quite a bit, trying to get a decent clearance, turning eastbound. I hear you get up to 5,000 feet or whatever, but I mean, generally, we're getting sent up all the way to Lake anyway. So any idea how to do it better than that?
I'll just do it. Are you willing to take 5,000 feet as a final? Sure. We can get you up over Huguenots.
Okay.
And that's the only altitude we have going up that way into New England. Because, remember all those pictures? Jets descending into Stillwater at 6, and then you turn around, there's another flow up there, so we're followed by another flow coming in from North Atlantic routes and wherever. There's always flows into New York. So we're tunneling underneath the New York arrivals. That's why we're limited to 5 only, and they can come back. You can come back at 4. Roughly Huguenot, Kingston, and so on. But I don't have the one memorized. But yeah, we stay all the way to Boston.
Yeah, right.
But if you file, see, our computer will accept that routing. You can file it, but if you file 6 or higher, there you go to Lake again. It's going to spit out that routing.
Okay, good advice.
But just keep it at 5, and we should be able to work it out. Good.
When we establish communication with the class college, do you want to hear our N number, Allentown approach, Cessna 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to hear from you, or do you want to
That'd be fantastic.
Right. So do you want to hear who I am, where I am, and what my intentions are?
On the second transmission. Let's go with who you are on the first one.
Who you are, okay, gotcha.
Because, well, you know you've got different levels of activity volume going on, and if you're just trying to jump in the middle there somewhere, wherever you can get it, it's like, all right, the controller's busy, I want to get me in there, but your VFR, let him answer you at the controller's priority level of the other thing he said he has going on. If he's not busy and the frequency's kind of quiet, he's going to come right back, probably give you a squawk all in the same breath, and then ask you what you want to do.
Because flight following is pretty much voluntary from our standpoint, and to a certain extent to your standpoint, about what percentage of the flight following gets managed actively? In other words, do people on flight following VFR drop out?
You mean after, let's say, when you're 20 miles away from Allentown, drop out?
Well, how much of how often is there not any attention paid to flight following?
You check on and then we call you and nobody answers? Is that what you
check in and I don't get a call when there's something in the area that I should know about. It's not positive control.
No, it's not positive control. We're giving you advisory based on our priorities. Our first priorities are IFR aircraft, VFR aircraft. In the middle of the class, Charlie will be second, and then I'll bring it down and say the rest of the VFRs for advisory purposes outside of the core of the Charlie. That's going to be our third priority.
Right. And of that third tier, about what percentage would we, I don't want to say be ignored, but if there's a potential conflict, would we not?
Hopefully zero.
Zero.
Hopefully is the best answer. I mean that's, you're on our frequency for a reason, and we're going to do our best job to give you the advisories that we see.
Okay.
So, it's much easier for us to miss a primary, but with the advanced equipment we have, everything is digital. Even a primary shows up as a digitally represented on the display, whereas in the old analog world, it was much easier to just not see it.
Right.
So something is showing up.
So figure if we're in flight following, we're pretty safe.
You want to say safer than if you're not?
Safer.
I think I'd go home with that answer.
Well, John, thank you for being here. Thank you for being our expert. And thank you for your hospitality. All right, so thank all of you for being here. Thanks for investing your time in the interest of safety and continuing education. If you're interested in learning more about airspace, that resources sheet has all kinds of free stuff on there. I would urge you to download those resources, go to the websites, and take the courses that are offered there, and even consider buying the King course or the Sporties course. They are really good. So spend some time with your favorite CFI and go over some of this stuff, maybe areas of particular interest that you've got you haven't had a chance to play with yet. So thank you.
You see why I gave him the award today, huh? When John Herber at the control tower, when Bill from the FAA just sit there quiet, it's because he knows the regs and he read more of the regs and the current rules than we did. We're sitting there wondering, wow. When he started quoting from the air traffic control manual, I said, I'm not opening my mouth.
That honestly was just a fluke.
But this is what, and you guys all know him, so Craig's a humble guy. But the amount of work he puts in for my programs, that's why I gave him the certificate of appreciation.
Thank you for that.
I don't have a whole lot of guys who will do that for me. I do have other people that do that for me. But and thanks for your patience. This went a little long today, a lot longer than we wanted, right?
Longer than I thought. But
and thanks to John Herber for coming out and
Did I hear Craig say he's been flying 15 years?
50.
I didn't want to. Joe, man, we're gonna wreck our whole surprise, man. No. He is. He's in the middle of applying for the Master Pilot Award. So yes, he's. So that'll be the next party here, right? There'll be a Master Pilot Award.
See, I thought they gave that to old guys.
Huh?
I thought they only gave it to old guys.
So thank you very much, and it was one of the best turnouts I've seen. I don't know, in 6 years. But be careful driving home from the safety seminar. You know?
So just one thing too here on parking. I know many of you parked on the ramp out here. We need to move airplanes back in here. So if you're staying for lunch at the restaurant, which I hope you are, please move your car from the ramp to the restaurant parking lot. Again, thanks for coming. Great to see you all here, and see you sometime soon.